The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the cold of winter, nor the cold of the wind, but a damp cold, the cold of stone and dirt against his bare back. Then came the pain. It was everywhere, in his ribs, in his cheekbone, in his mouth, where his tongue detected the taste of blood and something sour. He opened his eyes and saw the sky, a narrow strip of gray sky between the two walls of the alley. Somewhere nearby, seagulls were squawking. It stank of fish, urine, and rotten planks. He tried to sit up and realized his body wouldn't obey him, not because it was broken, but because it wasn't his own. His arms were too short, his legs were too light, his fingers were thin and dirty. He looked at his palms and didn't recognize them. They were a child's hands. He remembered everything at once: the fire, the smoke in his lungs, Theo in his arms, the firefighter's shout, the beam flying down from above, and the darkness, a long, unbroken darkness without dreams. And then this alley, this body, this city he didn't know. He had been 26 years old, now he was 14, and he was lying in someone else's dirt in a strange world, barefoot and beaten. He would have laughed if his jaw hadn't hurt so much. All right. He sat up. The world swayed but held steady. The alley stretched off in both directions. To the left, a streetlight and the sound of voices. To the right, darkness. He chose the light. Always choose the light. That's the first rule of night shifts at the hospice. He got to his feet and took 3 steps before he heard a scream. Not a loud scream, more like a rasp, the sound of someone whose mouth had been covered. Eli turned his head. 10 steps away, 2 men were pinning an old woman against the wall. One was holding her by the throat. The other was snatching a small pouch from her hands. The old woman was completely gaunt, small as a teenager. Her gray hair was plastered to her skin. She wasn't screaming because she couldn't. The men were drunk. They reeked of cheap ale and sweat. Sailors. Broad shoulders, tattoos on their forearms. Each of them weighed 3 times as much as Eli's new body. His brain told him to walk past them. You're wounded. You don't know where you are. You weigh 40 kilograms. His legs told him the same thing, but his hands had already picked up a rock from the ground. He wasn't thinking. He never thought at all in moments like moments. Once at the hospice, the father of one of the patients showed up drunk and started yelling at a nurse. Eli stepped between them and took a punch to the jaw. Then security subdued the man. Afterward, Eli sat on the floor in the hallway, touching his loose tooth with his tongue. A coworker asked him, "Why did you do that?" He didn't know. He still didn't know. The rock hit the first sailor in the back of the head. Not hard, but hard enough to make him turn around. Eli saw his face, red, angry, small eyes, a scar on his chin. The sailor said something rude. Eli couldn't make out the words, but he understood the tone. The universal language of people who are about to beat you up. The second sailor let go of the old woman and stepped toward Eli. She slid down the wall and remained sitting in the mud. The first blow landed in his stomach. Eli doubled over. The air rushed out of his lungs like from a punctured ball. A second blow to the side, to his ribs, knocked him to the ground. He fell face first into a puddle, his mouth filled with dirty water. He started coughing. A boot struck him in the side, then again. He curled up into a ball and covered his head with his hands. That was something he knew how to do. This body didn't know how to fight, but it knew how to endure. Between blows, he managed to think that the life of this boy, whose body he had taken over, hadn't been a bed of roses. Then there was no time to think, because one of the sailors grabbed him by the hair and lifted him up. Eli opened his mouth and sank his teeth into the sailor's wrist. He bit like a dog, with the full force of his jaws. The sailor screamed. A second sailor tried to pry him off, but Eli held on. Blood trickled down his chin. Someone else's blood, salty and hot. He didn't let go. And at the same time, he was screaming. Not words, just sound. The loud, shrill scream of a 14-year-old boy who had nothing to lose. The scream echoed off the walls of the alley and carried upward. A window slammed somewhere.
Someone cursed. Another window. A woman's voice. A man's voice. A lantern swayed. Footsteps could be heard. The sailors exchanged glances. The first one finally wrenched his wrist free from between Eli's teeth and flung him against the wall.
Eli hit the back of his head on a rock, and for a second the world went white. When his vision returned, the sailors were already leaving, quickly, without looking back. A man with an oil lamp appeared from around the corner and started shouting, "Who's here? What happened?" Eli lay against the wall, staring at the ceiling of the alley. There was no ceiling, there was the sky, dark, starless. He was alive. It was unexpected. Footsteps nearby, quiet, shuffling, the smell of herbs and old fabric. An old woman sat down next to him, right in the mud. She didn't say anything, she just put her hand on his head. Her fingers were dry and warm. She stroked his hair, his dirty hair, matted with blood. Eli closed his eyes. In a past life, his grandmother used to stroke him like that, a long time ago. He was about 6 years old. He'd come down with chickenpox and was lying in bed, covered in green antiseptic ointment. His grandmother sat beside him, stroking his head and telling him that it would all pass. It all did. His grandmother died when he was 12. He didn't cry then. He wasn't crying now either. He just lay there, breathing. The old woman leaned toward him. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. She said he didn't know her, that he didn't know what she was capable of or what she was worth, that he simply wanted her to live. And for that, she wanted to give him what was hers, because he needed it more. Eli didn't understand what she was talking about. He wanted to say that he didn't need anything, that he'd simply done what any normal person would have done. But he didn't get the chance, because suddenly his chest felt warm. Not hot, not painful, warm. As if someone had lit a candle right behind his ribs. The light was soft, golden. It came from within and filled him, spreading from the center of his chest to his fingertips, to the soles of his feet, to the top of his head. Along with the light came knowledge. Not words, not images, a sensation. His fingers suddenly understood how to feel the grass, which stem was alive and which was dead, where there was sap in a leaf and where there was emptiness, how a chamomile smells when it's ready and how it smells when it's still too early. It was someone else's knowledge, someone else's hands, the hands of this old woman. Hands that for 60 years had gathered herbs, dried them, ground them into powder, and brewed them in clay mugs. He felt all of this in a single second and gasped for breath. The old woman removed her hand from his head. She was smiling. Eli looked at her and saw that she was crying, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her wrinkles like canals. She said her name was Martha, just Martha, and that it was time for her to go home. She stood up, slowly, holding on to the wall, and walked off into the darkness of the alley. Eli remained lying there. A foreign spark burned in his chest. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know how it worked. He didn't know that this old woman had just given him more than he could have imagined. He knew only one thing. He was 14 years old. He was in a strange world. He had no shoes, no food, no roof over his head, no name that meant anything here. And he had a warmth in his chest that wouldn't fade. He sat down. Then he stood up. Then he took a step. Then another. He walked toward the light of the street lamp, where there was a noise, where the people were. He always went where the people were. The port of Bryn Mawr greeted him with the smell of salt and rotten ropes. The waterfront was long and winding. Wooden piers stretched out into the black water. Ships were moored side by side. Large three-masted merchant ships, small fishing boats with tattered sails. Even at night, the piers were a hive of activity. Porters hauled crates. Sailors mended rigging. Merchants counted barrels by torchlight. No one paid him any attention. A skinny, battered, barefoot boy. There were plenty like him here. He saw them. In every crevice between the warehouses. Under overturned boats. Behind piles of trash. Children. Skinny. Dirty. With eyes that looked at the world without expecting anything good. Eli walked past them and counted. A habit from the hospice. Always count. How many patients? How many beds? How many meals? How many blankets? There were no beds, no blankets, and no food here, but there were children. He counted 17 before he reached the end of the embankment. There was a bridge there, stone, old. It was dry underneath. Relatively speaking, Eli crawled under the bridge and lay down on the stones. They were cold, but at least they weren't wet. He curled up into a ball and pulled his knees to his chest. A spark was still burning in his chest. Warm, quiet, like a nightlight in a children's ward. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd figure it out. Tomorrow he'd understand where he was, what had happened to him, and what this warmth in his chest was. Tomorrow he'd find food, water, and shoes. Tomorrow. But for now, he would just breathe. In, out. In, out. He fell asleep. The morning began with a kick. Someone had kicked him in the thigh. Not hard, but hard enough to wake him up. Eli opened his eyes and saw a boy of about 10 standing over him. Red-headed, freckled, wearing a torn shirt 3 sizes too big. The boy looked down at him and spoke quickly. The words were familiar, but with a strange accent, a dockworker's slang. The boy said this was his spot, that he slept there every night, that if Eli didn't get out of the way, he'd be in trouble. Eli sat up and looked at him. The boy was thin, very thin. His ribs showed through the fabric. His wrists were like sticks. His eyes were angry, but beneath the anger lay fear. Eli had seen that fear 1,000 times. At the hospice, in the eyes of children brought there for the first time. Anger is just fear in armor. He raised his hands to show he wasn't going to fight. He said he was leaving, that he didn't know the spot was taken. The boy blinked. He had clearly expected a different reaction. Eli stood up, and his body reminded him of yesterday. His ribs ached with every breath. His cheekbone throbbed. His lip was swollen. His knee wouldn't bend properly. He staggered and grabbed hold of the bridge railing. The boy watched him. Then he said something else, quieter. He asked who had beaten him up like that. Eli replied that it was the sailors. The boy nodded as if it were perfectly normal. I guess that was normal here. Eli stepped out from under the bridge into the morning light. The port looked different in the sun. Dirtier, bigger, louder. The waterfront was teeming with people. Dockworkers, merchants, fishermen, women with baskets, soldiers in worn leather armor, and children everywhere, barefoot, quick. They scurried between the adults' legs like rats, stealing, begging, hiding. Eli stood there watching it all, trying to figure out where he'd ended up. The world looked like medieval Europe if it had been drawn by someone who was very tired. Stone buildings with wooden extensions, tile roofs, signs with pictures instead of letters, a tavern with a painted mug, a blacksmith shop with a painted hammer, a pharmacy with a painted leaf. A cathedral stood on a hill overlooking the city, white, tall, with 3 spires. On each spire, a set of scales, golden. Even from here, they glistened in the sun. The Church of the Scales. Eli didn't yet know what that meant, but he remembered it. His body wanted to eat. It didn't just want to eat, it demanded it. His stomach clenched and unclenched like a fist. He tried to remember when this body had last eaten, but couldn't. The memory of its former owner was hazy. Fragments, smells, sensations, blows, lots of blows. This boy had been beaten, often. Eli pushed those memories aside and focused on the task at hand. Food, water, shoes, in that order. He walked along the waterfront and looked around. At the hospice, they'd taught him the most important survival skill, to observe. Don't ask, don't grab. First, look. Understand how the system works, where things are, who throws what away, when and where. Within an hour, he had figured out the layout of the port. The fish market opened at dawn and closed by noon. Waste was dumped into the canal at the 3rd pier. The bakery on the corner of the 2nd street from the waterfront put out stale bread in a wooden crate by the back door. The dock workers had lunch at the 5th warehouse and sometimes left their leftovers behind. A well with drinking water stood in the square in front of the cathedral. Everyone was allowed to use it. He started with the water. He drank for a long time, greedily. The water was cold and clear, and it was the best he'd ever tasted in either of his lives. Then he went to the bakery. A box of stale bread stood by the door. There were 4 pieces inside, hard as a rock. Eli took one and bit into it. His teeth barely broke through the crust, but inside, the bread was still edible. He chewed slowly, moistening it with his saliva. He put the second piece in his pocket, or rather into what was left of his pocket in these rags. He didn't touch the remaining 2 pieces. Whoever someone else knows about this box, too. The third day. He spent it at the port. He walked around. He looked. He listened. The language of this world was similar to English, but not quite the same. Some words sounded familiar. Others were foreign. His body remembered the language better than his brain. By the evening of the third day, Eli could speak well enough to understand conversations and respond with simple phrases. He learned that the city was called Bryn Mawr, that it was one of the ports of the kingdom of Aurelian, that a temple of the Church of the Scales stood on the hill, that at the docks they paid 2 copper coins a day if you could haul crates, that children without parents were taken away by the collectors if they were caught. No one said where they were taken, but everyone knew it was bad. On the 4th day, he earned his first copper coins. He hauled crates of fish from the boats to the market stalls. His body was weak but stubborn. By evening, his back was on fire and his fingers wouldn't straighten. 2 copper coins. With that, he could buy a bowl of porridge at a cheap tavern by the docks. He bought it. He sat down on a step. He ate the hot porridge with a wooden spoon and thought that this was happiness. Simple, dull, primitive happiness. A hot meal after a full day's work. He smiled and probably looked like a madman, because the waitress gave him a strange look. On the 5th day, he found Martha, or rather, she found him. He was sitting by the wall of a warehouse, examining the grass growing out of a crack in the stone. He couldn't explain why. His hands just reached out for it. His fingers touched the stem, and he felt it. It was thyme. Wild. Strong. A whole bunch in the crack of an old wall. His fingers knew it. Not him. His fingers. That very spark Martha had given him. The hands of a herb gatherer. He sat there, sorting through the stems and sorted them. This one's fresh. This one's dry. This one's full of sap. That's what he was doing when Martha found him. She stood over him and watched, silently, for a long time. Then she sat down beside him. She looked better than she had that night. Cleaner, calmer, but still just as small and thin. She asked if he knew what he was doing. Eli replied that he didn't know, that his hands knew on their own, but his mind didn't understand. Martha nodded. She said that what he was feeling was a spark. Her spark. She explained it slowly and simply. In every person there is a seed, their greatest gift, their main talent. It can be passed on to another. But the Church of Libra banned it 300 years ago. Now, passing it on costs gold and requires a ritual and is permitted only to the nobility. And what happened between them in the alley was forbidden. It was ancient. It was real. Eli listened and nodded. He wasn't surprised. Once you've died and woken up in a stranger's body in a strange world, your threshold for surprise rises sharply. Martha told him that what he'd received from her wasn't all of her knowledge, but an imprint, a foundation. To become a true herbalist, he would need to study, for a long time, but his hands already knew where to start. She offered to teach him. Eli looked at her. She was over 70. She lived alone in a tiny room above a fish shop. She was poor, she was a nobody in this town, and she was offering him the only thing she had, her time. He said yes. On the 6th day, the lessons began. In the morning, he hauled crates at the port. In the afternoon, he went to Martha's. She taught him to distinguish between herbs, not from books, but by smell, by texture, by taste. He chewed the leaves, and she told him what they were and what they were used for. Mint for headaches, sage for inflammation, plantain for wounds, chamomile for sleep, thyme for a cough. His hands memorized things faster than his mind. Iskra acted as an accelerator. Where an ordinary student would spend a month memorizing a single plant, Eli would grasp it in a day. But only the basics, just the foundation, dosages, combinations, contraindications. All of this had to be truly learned. Martha gave no leeway. She was a strict teacher. If he made a mistake, she would silently take the bundle of herbs from him and make him start over. If he was in a hurry, she would say that a hasty healer is worse than a murderer. He listened. He was used to listening to his elders. The nurses at the hospice had taught him that. Listen to those who know more. Don't argue, just do it. On the 7th day, he saw the boy. Morning, the port, noise. Eli was walking to the fish market for work. Near the third pier, a woman was sitting on the ground. She was holding a child of about 7 close to her. The boy was coughing, hard, deeply. With every exhalation, droplets of blood flew from his mouth. Blood spurted from his mouth. The mother rocked back and forth, whispering something. A man in clean clothes stood nearby. A doctor. Eli knew this from the bag of tools slung over his shoulder. The doctor spoke calmly and matter-of-factly. 3 gold pieces for the examination and medicine. Without payment up front, he wouldn't even look at the boy. The mother looked up at him. In them was something Eli had seen hundreds of times, the despair of a person with no money whose child is dying. The doctor shrugged and walked away. Eli stood there watching. Something inside him tightened, a familiar feeling, an old one, that very feeling that had driven him to work at the hospice, the same feeling that had made him pull Theo out of the fire, not heroism, not bravery, just the impossibility of walking away, a physical impossibility, like the impossibility of not breathing. He walked over and sat down next to the woman. She looked at him in fear. A skinny, battered teenager in rags, not exactly the most trustworthy-looking doctor. Eli looked at the boy. The cough was wet, deep, coming from the chest. A fever, dry lips, cloudy eyes. It was bronchitis, severe. Without treatment, it would turn into pneumonia in a couple of days, and then it would be over. Eli didn't know how he knew that. Martha Spark didn't provide medical knowledge, but his past life did. 6 years spent with sick children, 6 years listening to doctors' conversations, 6 years observing symptoms. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to tell the difference between a cold and something serious. He pulled some thyme out of his pocket. He'd gathered it yesterday from a crack in the wall, a handful of dry stems. Then he got up and walked to the bakery. There was bread in a box behind the back door. He took a crust of bread. Then he headed to the port warehouses. Near the third one stood a sack of salt. It was full of holes. Salt was spilling out onto the ground through the holes. He gathered a pinch. He returned to the woman. She looked at him, confused. Eli sat down. He rubbed the thyme between his palms. The spark in his hands knew what to do. His fingers found the right motion on their own. Grind the stems into a paste. Mix with the breadcrumbs. Add a pinch of salt. Pour in warm water from the flask he'd filled that morning at the well. The result was a murky, warm slurry. Not medicine, more like a folk remedy. A thyme infusion with breadcrumbs. In his old world, this would have been called a placebo. But here, his hands knew that time was stronger in this world. Much stronger. The herbalist's spark hummed in his fingers. He brought the spoon to the boy's lips. The mother watched him. He told her it would help, that it was just herbs, that it wouldn't hurt him. She hesitated, then she nodded, because she had no other choice. The boy swallowed the first spoonful. He coughed. He swallowed the second, the third. Eli fed him slowly, patiently, just as he had fed the children at the hospice, spoonful by spoonful, without rushing. Half an hour later, the coughing subsided. An hour later, the boy stopped shivering. His fever was breaking. She could feel it with her hand on his forehead. The mother grabbed Eli's hand and pressed it against her face. She was crying. She kept saying thank you, over and over. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then it happened again. Warmth. In his chest. A second flower. A second spark. It came gently, not like a blow, like a breath. And with it came new knowledge. His hands suddenly understood the fabric. How to wring it dry in a single motion. How to fold it so there were no creases. How to feel every fiber. The hands of a laundress. Eli laughed, loudly. For the first time in a week. His mother looked at him, bewildered. He couldn't explain it. He'd saved a child from bronchitis, and the universe had given him the skill of laundry, a laundress. He was a former hospice volunteer in the body of a 14-year-old orphan, and now he could do laundry like a pro. Perfectly. He definitely needs some bandages. The second week in Bryn Mawr began with rain. 3 days straight. The port came to a standstill. Ships weren't being unloaded. There was no work for the dock workers. Eli sat under the awning by the warehouse and counted his coins. 11. Enough for 3 days of porridge, or 5 days of bread, or 1 pair of holy boots from the market. He chose the boots. His feet were covered in scrapes and blisters, and one was cut by a shard of glass. The boots were leather, cracked, with a hole in the right toe. But they were there. That was what mattered. He put them on and felt like a human being. It's amazing how little it takes to feel that way. A pair of shoes, a piece of bread, a roof that doesn't leak. On the third day of rain, Marta called him over to her place. Her little room was above the fish shop. Small, dark, It smelled of dried herbs and fish from below. One bed, one table, one shelf with clay pots. Martha sat on the bed, sorting through dry leaves. She showed him a new plant. It was called moonroot. It grew only in the shade against the walls of old houses. It looked like a pale carrot the size of a pinky finger. Martha said that moonroot reduced fever better than anything else in her collection. But it had to be dried properly. 3 days in the dark, then grind it into a powder. Then store it in clay, not wood, because wood drains its power. Eli listened and memorized. His hands already knew how to handle the root. A spark guided him. But Martha explained why. She taught him not just what to do, but why. It was like at the hospice. The nurses didn't just say, "Give the medicine at 8." They said, "Give the medicine at 8 because after 4 hours, the concentration in the blood drops below the therapeutic level." Understanding why made the knowledge real, not mechanical, but alive. On the 4th day, the rain stopped, and Eli returned to the port. Work, crates, coins, routine. He was getting used to it. His body was getting stronger. The bruises were healing. His ribs hurt less. He ate regularly. Porridge in the morning, bread in the evening. Sometimes fish, not whole, but the scraps the merchants threw away. He'd learned to tell fresh scraps from rotten ones. The herbalist's spark helped. If the fish smelled a certain way, it was still edible. If it smelled like this, it was better not to risk it. His sense of smell had become more precise. Not supernatural, just more attentive. He noticed smells he used to miss. Sour milk, fresh bread 2 blocks away, wet wool, metal and sweat. That was the spark. It worked like a filter. It singled out the scents that mattered from the chaos of smells. On the 5th day after the rain, he met Lily. It happened in the evening. Eli was sitting on the steps outside the tavern, eating porridge. The bowl rested on his knee. The spoon was wooden. The porridge was hot. He ate and thought about how tomorrow he needed to find the moonroot by the north wall of the old warehouse. Martha had said it grew there. A hand slipped toward his pocket. The remaining copper coins lay there, 6 of them. The hand wasn't his. Small, quick, dirty. Eli grabbed the wrist without thinking, a reflex from a past life. At the hospice, the kids used to steal pills. You had to keep an eye on their hands. He turned his head and saw a girl, about 12, maybe younger, skinny to the point of being transparent. Her hair was black and tangled. Her eyes were gray and angry. She jerked, tried to break free. Eli held her tight, not hard enough to hurt her, but firmly. She hissed like a cat. She called him a word he didn't understand, but from the tone he guessed it was a curse. Eli looked at her, then at his bowl, then back at her. He let go of her wrist. She jumped back 2 steps. She stood there, ready to run. Her legs were half bent. Her body was turned toward the alley. Her eyes darted between his face and the exit. Eli picked up the bowl of porridge and held it out to her. She didn't move. He set the bowl on the step between them and stepped back. She looked at the porridge, then at him, then back at the porridge. She approached, slowly, like a stray cat approaching a saucer of milk. She snatched the bowl and ran off into the alley. He could hear her eating, quickly and greedily, choking, then eating again. Eli sat on the step and listened. It was a familiar sound. The sound of a hungry child who'd been given food. A minute later, the bowl flew out of the alley and rolled over the cobblestones to his feet. Empty, licked clean. Eli picked it up and took it back to the tavern. The next evening, he bought 2 bowls of porridge. He ate one. He set the second one on the same step. Then he left. In the morning, the bowl was empty. On the 3rd evening, he set the bowl down and stayed. He sat quietly. He waited. She emerged from the alley. She stopped when she saw him. She stood there for a minute, 2. Then she came over. She sat down at the other end of the step. She took the bowl. She ate, in silence. He was silent too. The 2 of them sat on the step, silent and eating. She finished eating. She set the bowl down. She looked at him. She told him her name. Lily. Just her name, nothing else, and she left. Eli nodded after her. Lily. The 3rd week, he began to notice things. Not with his eyes, with something else. When he walked past people at the port, he could sense it. Not thoughts, not emotions, more like a shape, as if every person had an empty space inside them with a specific shape. For the hungry dock worker, the emptiness was in his stomach, heavy, aching. For the woman holding a child, the emptiness was in her arms. She was tired of holding on. For the old fisherman, the emptiness was in his back, a pain that had lingered for years. Eli didn't understand what it was. A side effect of the sparks, maybe. Two sparks inside, the herbalist and the laundress. They weren't big, they weren't powerful, but they were foreign. They carried the memories of other people, the pain of other people, and through that pain, Eli began to feel what belonged to others. He asked Martha. She was silent for a long time. Then she said it was normal, that this was how it was meant to be, that those who carried many sparks in ancient times saw the world differently. They sensed people the way a healer senses a wound. Not a diagnosis, a sensation. She said it was a gift and a curse, because feeling someone else's pain and not being able to help everyone is torture. Eli thought that Martha knew what she was talking about. She'd lived with it for 70 years. By the end of the third week, he was making 2 copper coins a day from his job. Lessons from Martha. Knowledge of 20 herbs. A pair of holy boots. A little girl who stole food and came every evening to eat his porridge, and 2 flowers in his chest that burned quietly day and night. He was still sleeping under the bridge. He needed a roof over his head. Not for himself. He could sleep under the bridge for another year, but the cold weather would set in soon. And Lily was sleeping somewhere in the back alleys, and so was the red-haired boy who'd chased him out from under the bridge. And the other 15 children he'd counted on his first day. He needed a place. He started looking. Every day after work, he wandered through the port district and looked at the buildings. Abandoned, empty, ruined. There were many of them. The port of Bryn Mawr had once been larger. An entire district of warehouses stood empty. The roofs had caved in, the walls were cracked, but they were still standing. On the 21st day, he found it. A warehouse right by the water. Stone walls, a wooden roof but intact. 1 large room, 2 windows, a door on its hinges. Inside it was empty, dirty, dusty, but dry. He went inside and stood in the middle. He looked around. 20 people could fit in here, maybe more. If he cleaned it out, fixed it up, and set up some cots. He stepped outside and looked up at the sky. Gray, as always. This would be their home. He didn't know whose yet, but he knew it wouldn't be just his. That evening, he told Martha. She looked at him for a long time and said he was crazy. That a single teenager couldn't open a shelter, that he didn't even have enough to feed himself. Eli nodded. She was right. He was crazy. But he'd already been crazy in his past life when he went to work at a hospice for peanuts, and when he ran into the burning building after Theo, and when he bit the sailor on the wrist. He didn't know how to be normal. Martha looked at him, then she smiled, for the first time ever, a small, dry smile. She said she'd help, that she had knowledge. Herbs, recipes, that's his starting capital. She'll teach him how to make ointments and tinctures. He'll sell them at the market, cheaply, for pennies, for those who can't afford a doctor. It'll bring in money, not much, but enough to get started. Eli said thank you. Martha replied that she was the one who should be saying thank you. He didn't understand why. She didn't explain. The warehouse looked even worse in daylight. Eli stood at the entrance and made a list, in his head, because he didn't have any paper. The roof was intact, but 3 boards were rotten. They need to be replaced. The floor is stone, dirty. He needs water and a brush. The walls are cracked, but the load-bearing walls are intact. The windows have no glass. He needs cloth or boards to cover them at night. The door is hanging on a single hinge. He needed a nail. There was no stove. That was the main problem. You can't live here in the winter without a fire, and winter in Bryn Mawr, according to Martha, begins in 2 months. He started with the floor. He hauled water from the well in a bucket he found in a neighboring dilapidated warehouse. The bucket was leaking. He plugged the hole with a rag. He scrubbed the floor for 4 hours, on his knees, with his hands. His experience as a laundry worker came in handy. His hands knew how to scrub, how to wring out a rag in a single motion until it was dry, how to work with water so it wouldn't spread but would flow in the right direction. A strange skill for a strange job. By evening, the floor was clean. Gray stone emerged from beneath the dirt. Smooth, no holes, a good floor. The next day, he set to work on the roof. 3 rotten boards. He needed new ones. He had no money. But at the port, he'd noticed something. When they broke down old fish crates, the boards were tossed into a pile by the 3rd warehouse. Eli went to see the foreman of the stevedores, a big man named Barrow, hands like logs, a voice like the creak of a winch. Eli asked if he could take some boards from the pile. Barrow looked him up and down, asked why. Eli told the truth. Fixing the roof. Barrow grunted, said, Take them. They burn that pile once a week anyway. Eli hauled off 6 forwards, one at a time, on his shoulder, across half the town. His back ached, but his legs carried him. He nailed the boards down with rusty nails he found on the warehouse floor. He hammered them in with a rock because he didn't have a hammer. Crooked, lopsided, but the roof held. It rained that night, and not a single drop fell inside. Eli lay on the floor in his clean, dry storage shed, listening to the rain on the roof and smiling into the darkness. He fixed the door on the 3rd day. He found a rusty hinge in the trash by the blacksmith shop. He picked it up. He fitted it on. The door closed. Not all the way. There was a gap a finger's width wide, but it closed. He covered the windows with burlap he'd bought for 3 copper coins at the market, 2 strips of coarse fabric. He hung them on nails and tied them down at the bottom so the wind wouldn't blow them away. Light filtered through the fabric, soft, diffused, beautiful. He thought that in a past life, he would never have called burlap on the windows beautiful. The stove remained. That was more complicated. He didn't know how to build a stove. The herbalist Iskra knew how to dry herbs over a fire, but not how to build a hearth. He went to see Marta. She thought for a moment and said she knew someone, an old stonemason named Gregor. He lives on the outskirts. He hardly works anymore because his hands shake, but he knows everything about stone and fire. Martha took him there. Gregor turned out to be a huge old man with a gray beard down to his waist. He was sitting on a bench outside his house, looking out at the sea. His hands really were shaking, a severe tremor. He could no longer lay stones evenly, but his mind was still sharp. He listened to Eli. He looked at him with the same long, steady gaze as Martha had. He asked why the boy needed a furnace in an abandoned warehouse. Eli said the children were freezing. Gregor was silent. Then he said he'd show him. He wouldn't build it, he'd show him how, because his hands wouldn't hold the stones. But if Eli was willing to haul stones and mix clay, then Gregor would tell him how. For 3 days they built the stove. Or rather, Eli built it, while Gregor sat nearby on a crate and gave orders. Stones from here, clay from there. No, not like that. Turn it. Press it down. Harder. 1 more layer. The chimney up. Like that. Yes. Eli hauled stones from the shore. He mixed clay with sand and water. He laid row after row. Gregor corrected him with his words. Sometimes, with a trembling hand, he pointed the way. By evening on the 3rd day, the stove was standing. Small, a little crooked, but with a chimney that went through the wall to the outside. Eli lit the first fire. He'd gathered firewood on the shore, driftwood, salt-cured wood. It burned with a crackle and sparks. The smoke went up the chimney. Not all of it. Some of it hung beneath the ceiling. But the stove was working. Heat spread through the stones and filled the warehouse. Gregor stood by the door and watched. His trembling hands hung at his sides. He looked at the stove the boy had built according to his instructions. Generally even. Functional. He said it wasn't bad. Not bad for a first try. And there was something in his voice that Eli had heard before. Gratitude. Not for anything specific, but for the fact that someone had asked him for help. For the fact that his knowledge was still needed by someone else. For the fact that his trembling hands could still offer something to the world. Even if not a stone, but a word. Gregor placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. Heavy, trembling. He said the boy was a good stonemason, that he had the right hands for it, that if he wanted, he'd teach him more. And a 3rd flower bloomed in Eli's chest, warm, heavy, rich. It wasn't the herbalist or the laundress. It was something else. His hands suddenly understood stone. Weight, shape, balance. How one stone fits on top of another. Where mortar is needed and where the stone holds on its own. The hands of a stonemason. Not mere skill, a foundation. The intuition of an old man who had spent 60 years building walls and ovens and bridges and knew stone like a friend. 3 sparks. The herbalist, the laundress, the stonemason. A strange combination. Useless for a hero. Perfect for someone who's going to build a house. Lily showed up in the evening. She came to the steps of the tavern as usual, but Eli wasn't there. He saw her from the window of the warehouse. She was standing there, staring at the empty steps. Then she sat down. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. He came out. She turned her head. Angry gray eyes. She said he was late, that she had other things to do, that she didn't have time to wait for him. Eli apologized. She blinked. He asked her to come with him, to show her something. She didn't go. She followed him, keeping a distance of 10 steps, like a cat, pretending she was going about her business. He led her to the warehouse. He opened the door. A stove was burning inside. It was warm. It was dry. The floor was clean. The burlap on the windows glowed softly. Lily stood in the doorway and looked around. Her face was inscrutable. But Eli saw how her fingers clenched the sleeve of her torn jacket, how she drew the warm air into her nose, how her shoulders dropped slightly. He said she could sleep here if she wanted to, that it wasn't his house, that it belonged to no one, that anyone could come and stay. Lily looked at him for a long time. Then she came in. She chose a corner by the wall, the one farthest from the door, with her back to the wall and her face toward the exit, like a small animal ready to run at any second. She sat down.
Pulled her knees up to her chest. He didn't approach her. He took some bread out of his bag and placed it in the middle of the floor. He set a mug of water next to it. Then he went to his corner, lay down, closed his eyes. Half an hour later, he heard her eating, quietly, almost silently. She had learned to eat quietly. It's a habit of children who are beaten for making noise. Eli knew this. He'd seen it at the hospice. Children from troubled families eat like shadows, without a sound, without asking, as if apologizing for taking up space. The next day he woke up and she was there, in her corner. Curled up in a ball, asleep, small, dirty, with her fist under her cheek. He got up quietly, lit the stove, put water on to heat. When she woke up, warm porridge was waiting on the floor. He didn't look at her, didn't ask anything, just ate his portion in the other corner. She ate hers. Then she left. She came back that evening. On the third day, she brought a boy with her, the redhead, the one who'd chased Eli out from under the bridge. His name was Finn, 9 years old, an orphan, from the harbor. Lily didn't explain. She just brought him and set him down by the door. Finn stood there watching, big round eyes, red curls, rags. Eli set a third bowl on the floor. Finn sat down and started eating. By the end of the first month, there were 4 of them living in the warehouse. Eli, Lily, Finn, and a girl named Mia, 6 years old. Lily found her in a ditch near the fish market. Mia didn't speak. Not at all, not a word. She just stared with her big, dark eyes and clung to Lily's skirt. Lily said Mia was stupid, but she never let go of her hand. Never, not even in her sleep. 4 children, 1 stove, 1 bag of flour that Eli bought with a week's wages. Herbs drying on a rope under the ceiling, 3 blankets, he bought 2, Lily snatched the other one from, he didn't ask where. He had 3 sparks and not a single plan except one, to get up tomorrow and do a little more than yesterday. Eli stood at the pier and watched the sailors unload barrels of ale. He wasn't looking at the barrels. He was looking at the bakery's oven across the street. Every morning, smoke rose from the chimney. Every morning, the baker would open the door and carry out the trays. The smell of bread wafted through the neighborhood, rich, warm, and yeasty. Eli stood there and did the math. Flour cost 12 kopecks a sack. Salt costs 4 kopecks a handful. He didn't know where to get yeast. Butter is expensive. Water is free. He gathered firewood on the riverbank. He had an oven. He had hands. He lacked a baker's spark, but he had the hands of a herbalist who could tell what was fresh and what wasn't, and the hands of a laundress who knew how to work with dough. Because dough is like fabric. You have to knead it, stretch it, fold it, and feel when it's ready. A laundress's hands knew the texture, density, moisture. Maybe that's enough. He bought a bag of flour, a small one, with his last bit of money. He brought it to the storeroom and set it on the floor. Lily looked at the bag and asked what it was. He said, "Flour." She asked, "What for?" He said, "We're going to bake bread." She said he was an idiot, that he wasn't a baker, that you had to know how to bake bread. He agreed. He was an idiot, but idiots sometimes bake bread. The first attempt was a disaster. The dough stuck to their hands, to the floor, to In's hair. He'd stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Flour was everywhere. The water wasn't the right temperature. There was no yeast, and Eli tried to bake without it. The result? A flat, gray flatbread, hard as the sole of a boot. Lily took a bite. She chewed for a long time. She swallowed. She said it was the worst thing she'd ever eaten in her life. And she'd eaten rats. Eli didn't argue. The second attempt was slightly better. He realized the dough needed time. It needed to rest. His hands from doing laundry came to mind. Fabric needs to be left to settle after washing, to smooth out. Dough, too. He left it for 3 hours under a rag by the stove. It rose. Not much, but it rose. The flatbread turned out softer. Edible. Not tasty, but edible. Mia ate it in small bites and looked at Eli with wide eyes. Third attempt. He added salt. A little oil he'd begged from a market vendor in exchange for helping her carry her baskets. And a pinch of thyme. His herbalist's hands knew that thyme not only heals, but also adds flavor. The thyme flatbread was good. Not as good as bread from a bakery, but good as food made with one's own hands for people who have no one else to bake for them. Lily said it would do. That was the highest praise. Fourth attempt. He found some sourdough starter. Martha had given him the tip. Flour and water. Leave it in a warm place for 2 days. The microorganisms would do their job. He didn't know how to explain microorganisms in this world, but sourdough worked the same way in any world. On the 5th day, it had fermented. It smelled sour, alive. He added the sourdough starter to the dough and baked his first real loaf of bread. Round, golden, with a crispy crust, with a soft crumb. He broke it open and steam rose. The aroma filled the warehouse. Finn stood frozen, his mouth agape. Mia pressed herself against Lily and stared at the bread without blinking. Lily swallowed. Eli divided the bread into 4 pieces. He handed them out. He ate some himself. Hot bread with thyme, in a stone warehouse by the sea, with 3 children who looked at him as if he were a magician. He thought that in a past life he'd worked part-time at a night bakery. The irony was cruel and beautiful. He wasn't a baker, but he'd stood next to a baker. He'd watched the master at work. And now the laundress's hands gave him the texture and his memory gave him the sequence. That was enough. The next day, he baked 6 flatbreads with thyme, 4 for home. He took 2 to the market. He set them on an upside-down crate. Next to them, he placed a bunch of dried herbs, the bruise ointment he'd made according to Martha's recipe, and 3 clay pots of thyme infusion for coughs. He sat down and waited. The first customer arrived 2 hours later, a woman with a weary face. She looked at bread. She sniffed it. She asked how much it cost. Eli said 1 copper coin. She looked at him strangely. 1 copper coin for a flatbread with herbs. At the bakery, even the cheapest bread cost 3. She bought both. She left. She came back an hour later, with a friend. Her friend bought the ointment, 2 copper coins, and a little pot of herbal tea, 2 more. By evening, Eli had 8 copper coins in an empty box. He returned to the warehouse. Lily was sitting by the door, waiting. She asked how much. He showed her the coins. She counted them. Her gray eyes widened slightly. 8 copper coins in half a day. That was more than he earned as a loader. She said he could do more, that if he baked in the morning, the bread would be fresh and warm by the time the market opened. That fresh bread sold better, that she knew a spot at the market by the fountain where there were more people, that she could stand there for him while he baked. Eli looked at her. A 12-year-old thief with gray eyes was offering to be his saleswoman. He asked what she wanted in return. She said 2 flatbreads a day, 1 for herself and 1 for Mia. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then she shook it, briefly, firmly. That's how the bakery began. Every day, Eli would get up before dawn. He kneaded the dough by the light of the oven. He baked flatbreads, with thyme, with mint, with sage. Each batch with a different herb. Each flatbread cost 1 copper coin. Lily would take the trays and haul them to the market. She turned out to be a natural-born saleswoman. Not in the sense of politeness, I mean in terms of business acumen. She knew where to stand, when to shout, how to look at a customer so he wouldn't walk away. The copper coins started rolling in, not a river, a trickle, but a steady one. Meanwhile, Eli continued making ointments and infusions. Martha taught him every day. New recipes, new herbs, more complex, more nuanced. An ointment for joint pain for dock workers, a sleep infusion for sailors who couldn't fall asleep after storms, burn compresses for blacksmiths. He sold each recipe for 2 or 3 copper coins, cheap. The doctor at the port charged a gold coin per visit. A gold coin is 100 copper coins. People went to Eli, not because he was better than the doctor, because he was affordable, and because his remedies worked. The herbalist spark made every recipe a little more precise, a little stronger, a little more just right than you'd expect from a self-taught boy. After a week of trading, a stevedore came to him, a big man, that very foreman Barrow who had given him the roof boards. Barrow stood in front of his stall and looked down at him. He asked if it was true that his ointments helped. Eli replied that it depended on the pain. Barrow said his back hadn't straightened out since last winter, that the doctor wanted 2 gold pieces, that for 2 gold pieces he'd rather walk hunched over for the rest of his life. Eli asked him to sit down. Barrow sat on the crate. The crate creaked pitifully. Eli placed his hands on Barrow's back. Through the fabric of his shirt he felt it. Not the muscles, something deeper, that ability that had been growing within him to sense the shape of another's pain. Barrow's pain was heavy, stony, chronic, like a boulder that had lain in one place so long it had grown into the ground. Eli made an ointment, not an ordinary one. He mixed 3 recipes, mint for cooling, moonroot for deep warmth, and a drop of the oil Martha had given him for special occasions, fir oil, thick, smelling of the forest. He rubbed the ointment into Barrow's back, slowly, with hands that knew cloth and grass and stone. 3 sparks worked together. The laundress's hands knew the right pressure. The herbalist's hands knew where it hurt. The stonemason's hands knew how one stone fits upon another, how to shift one to release the other. Barrow exhaled, a long, slow exhale. His shoulders slumped, for the first time in a year. He turned his head. He looked at Eli. The foreman's eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, his eyes were just wet. "Thanks, kid," he said, simply and quietly. "Thanks." And the 4th spark blossomed in Eli's chest, gentle, powerful, like a tree root reaching deep into the earth. A loader's hands, grip strength, a sense of weight. The ability to lift heavy things without straining your back, knowing how to distribute the load so your body doesn't break. Eli looked at his hands, 14-year-old hands, thin, with long fingers. 4 sparks lived within them, a herbalist, a laundress, a bricklayer, a porter. He laughed, quietly, to himself. In any other story, by this point the hero would have received a sword or a spell or a secret technique. But he had the hands of a laundress and the back of a porter, and that was perfect. Because he didn't need a sword. He needed to feed 4 children, build a house, and heal people who had nowhere else to go. For that, he needed exactly those sparks. In the evening, he returned to the warehouse. Lily was counting the day's takings. Finn was sweeping the floor. Mia was sitting by the stove, staring into the fire. Quiet, calm. She still wasn't speaking, but she no longer flinched at every sound. Eli sat down against the wall and looked at them, the 4 of them. Him, a thief, a red-haired kid, a mute girl, a family, absurd, random, real. He thought that in his past life, he hadn't even had a cat. And now he had 3 kids, a bakery, a pharmacy, an abandoned warehouse by the sea, and 4 strangers' sparks in his chest that burned quietly and warmly like 4 candles in a dark room. Who gave him permission? No one. No one gave him permission. He just did it. As always. Lily looked up and asked why he was smiling. He said, "Nothing." She said he was strange. He agreed. The 2nd month began with Martha falling. Eli came to see her in the morning as usual. The door to the small room was open. Martha was lying on the floor between the bed and the table. Her eyes were open. She was breathing, but she wasn't moving. He ran over to her and picked her up. She was as light as a bird, bones beneath her skin, nothing else. He laid her on the bed. He checked her forehead. It was hot. Her pulse was weak, rapid. The herbalist's hands told him that something inside her was fading. Not an illness, not a wound, something deeper, like a candle running out of wax. Martha opened her eyes and looked at him. She told him not to fuss, that she was just tired, that at her age, sometimes her legs forget how to hold her up. Eli didn't believe her. He'd seen people die, 6 years in hospice care. He knew that look. The look of someone who knows time is running out, but doesn't want to scare those around them. He said nothing. He didn't argue. He just stayed. He made her some chamomile and mint tea. He tucked her in with a blanket. He sat beside her until she fell asleep. Then he quietly left. Outside, he leaned against a wall and closed his eyes. Something tightened in his chest. Not sparks, just ordinary human fear. He didn't want to lose her. She was the first person in this world who had seen him. Not the body, not the orphan. Him. He returned to the warehouse. Lily looked at his face and didn't ask anything. She could read people better than any adult. She simply set a bowl of porridge in front of him and sat down beside him, in silence. That was her way of showing she cared. Over the next few days, Eli was torn. In the morning, he baked bread. In the afternoon, he ran to Martha's. He checked on her, fed her, cleaned her little room, changed her water, dried the herbs she could no longer dry herself. In the evening, he returned to the warehouse. He counted money, fed the children, fixed something. He slept for 4 hours. He'd wake up and start all over again. Martha recovered after a week. She got back on her feet. She started walking, slower than before, but walking. She came to the warehouse and saw what he'd accomplished in a month. A clean floor, a working oven, burlap on the windows, and 4 children. Trays of flatbread by the door, bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling. She stood in the doorway and watched. Then she said he'd built a house. Eli replied that it was just a warehouse. Martha shook her head and repeated, a house. She started coming every day. She taught not only Eli, but also Lily, which herbs to gather, where to look for them, how to tell the useful ones from the poisonous ones. Lily listened with the same sullen, focused expression she wore while doing everything, as if she were resentful of the herbs for growing the wrong way. But she learned quickly. Martha taught Finn. The boy turned out to be nimble. His little fingers were quick and precise. He could sort seeds for hours without tiring. Martha said he'd make a good apothecary if he'd just stop picking his nose while working. Finn blushed all the way to the roots of his red hair. Mia sat by the stove and watched. She still hadn't spoken. But one morning, Eli found a bouquet of wildflowers by his bed. Small, crooked, tied with a blade of grass. Mia stood in the corner and watched him. He placed the bouquet in a mug of water, set it on the windowsill. Mia smiled. For the first time, barely noticeable, the corners of her lips. Then she turned away. The second month brought money. Not wealth, but stability. 20 copper coins a day from the flatbreads, 10 from the ointments and infusions, 30 copper coins. That was enough for flour and salt and butter and even meat once a week. Eli began to save. 5 copper coins a day into a tin can under the floorboard. After a month, there was 1.5 silver coins in the can. 1 silver coin is 50 copper coins. 1.5 silver coins is a fortune by a harbor rat standards. Barrow started coming every week for back ointment. He paid 5 copper coins. Eli took 3. Barrow would grumble and leave 5. It became a ritual. Barrow brought other dock workers. They brought their wives. The wives brought their neighbors. Word spread slowly but surely. The boy at the docks, he treats people cheaply. Bread with herbs, ointments for everything. Strange, polite. Bows to the elderly. Says thank you for every copper coin. Either a saint or a madman. By the middle of the second month, 2 more people came to the warehouse. A boy named Tom, 10 years old, the son of a longshoreman who died when a crane collapsed a month ago. His mother died in childbirth. No relatives. Barrow brought Tom, left him at the door like a package, said the boy had nowhere else to go. Eli looked at Tom. Tom was staring at the floor, skinny, quiet. His hands were calloused. He's 10 years old and his hands are calloused. Eli said, "Come in." Tom came in. He sat down by the stove next to Mia. Mia looked at him. Then, without a word, she moved over and made room for him by the warm wall. It was the first thing she'd ever done for another person in this house. The second was a girl, Emma, 8 years old, was brought in by Lily. She'd found her in an alley behind the fish market. Emma was hiding in a barrel that had once held salted fish. It stank so badly that at first Lily thought the barrel was still full. Emma didn't want to come out. Lily pulled her out by the collar, dragged her to the warehouse, set her down in front of Eli. "Here's another one," she said, as if she were talking about a stray kitten. Emma stood there trembling. Eli gave her some bread, then water, then a blanket. Then a spot by the wall. 6 of them. The warehouse was getting cramped. Eli needed beds, or at least cots. He went to see Gregor. The old mason listened to him and grunted. He said that a mason isn't a carpenter, but he knew the basics. He'd show him. They built 6 cots in 4 days, planks from old crates, ropes instead of nails where they were needed. Each cot was simple. A plank resting on 2 stone supports. On top, a sack stuffed with dry grass. Not a feather bed, but better than the floor. Gregor watched as Eli worked and nodded. The boy was a quick learner. His background as a stonemason made his hands sure with the material. He didn't have as good a feel for wood as he did for stone, but the principle was the same. Balance, weight, support. By the end of the 2nd month, the warehouse looked different. 6 cots along the walls, a stove in the center, a table by the window, a shelf with herbs, a shelf with bread, hooks on the wall for clothes, a broom in the corner, a bucket by the door. Not a palace. Not even a house by the standards of the normal world. But for the 6 children who, a month ago, had been sleeping in the mud, it was a palace. Eli stood in the center, looking at it and thinking of Martha. She was growing weaker, a little bit every day, like a river in a drought, slowly, imperceptibly, but he could see it. She walked more slowly, she spoke more softly. Sometimes she forgot her words. Sometimes she looked at him as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to do it. He waited. He didn't rush her. At the hospice, he'd learned to wait. People speak when they're ready, not before. One evening, Martha came into the warehouse. The children were asleep. The stove was smoldering. Eli was sitting at the table, grinding herbs for the morning ointments. Martha sat down across from him, silently. She sat there for a long time, watching him work. Then she spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. She said she had to tell him the truth, that the spark she'd given him on that first night wasn't just the work of a herbalist's hands, that there was something else inside her, something ancient, something the Church of Libra had been destroying for 300 years. She said that in ancient times, there were people called the keepers of sparks. They could accept others' gifts without a ritual, without gold, without the church, simply through gratitude, through genuine, sincere gratitude. The church forbade it because it was dangerous, not to people, to the church. If commoners could give sparks freely, then why pay with gold? Why would the church be needed? Why would the law of the seal be needed? The keepers were killed, one by one, for 300 years, until she was the only one left, the last one. An old woman in a tiny room above a fish shop, with a spark that was dying along with her. And when Eli rushed at those sailors for the sake of a stranger, an old woman, she understood. It was him, the one she had been waiting for. Not because he was special, not because he was a hero, but because he did it without thinking. Not for a reward, not for the spark, simply because he couldn't walk away. She passed on to him more than just the hands of a herbalist. She passed on to him the very ability to be a keeper, the right to receive other sparks through gratitude, the very thing that made him who he was in this world. Eli sat and listened. Her hands had stopped moving. The herbs lay on the table, unground. He looked at Martha. She looked at him. Tears welled up in her eyes, old, quiet tears, the kind that had been building up for 70 years. She said she hadn't asked his permission, that she had no right to decide for him, that she'd simply been afraid that he would die and everything would disappear. Eli reached across the table and took her hand. Dry, small, warm. He didn't say he forgave her. He didn't say he wasn't angry. He said thank you. Martha closed her eyes. Tears streamed from beneath her eyelids. She squeezed his hand. Tightly, as if clinging to the last rope on a sinking ship. They sat like that for a long time, in silence. By the light of the smoldering stove, 6 children slept around them. The wind rustled against the burlap on the windows. The sea roared beyond the wall. And Eli held the hand of the old woman who had given him everything she had, not because he deserved it, but because he happened to be there. Martha died on the 83rd day. Quietly, in her sleep, without pain. Eli knew because he felt it. He woke up in the middle of the night when one of the sparks in his chest flickered. It hadn't gone out. It had flickered, like a candle's flame when someone opens the door. And he understood, immediately, without a doubt. He got up, got dressed, left the warehouse. The children were asleep. Lily turned over in her sleep but didn't wake up. He walked through Bryn Mawr at night. Empty streets, oil lamps, the smell of the sea and rotting seaweed. His feet carried him of their own accord to the little room above the fish shop. The door wasn't locked. Martha was lying on the bed. The blanket was pulled up to her chin. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her face was peaceful. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, there was neither anxiety nor pain on her face, only peace. On the table next to the bed lay a piece of paper, folded in half. On it was a single word, his name, Eli. He picked up the paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was faint. The letters were shaky. She'd written this with hands that were already failing her. She apologized for not asking, for deciding for him. She wrote that he was the only one who had ever seen her. Not a bag of coins, not an old woman, not the keeper. Her. Just Martha. And for that, she had given him everything. She asked him to carry this message forward, not for her sake, for the sake of those who would come after, for the sake of the children who are born with sparks and die, carrying them to the grave, for the sake of a world that has forgotten that kindness is worth more than gold. Eli stood there, holding the piece of paper. His hands didn't tremble. His face was calm. He put the paper in his pocket. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He took her hand, cold, light, like a dry leaf. He sat there, holding her hand, and didn't cry. He'd learned not to cry at the hospice. 6 years, dozens of deaths, children, little ones, fair-haired. They passed away and he remained. Each time he thought he'd gotten used to it, and each time he realized he hadn't. He sat with Martha until dawn. When the sun broke through the dirty window of the small room, he stood up. He covered her face with a sheet. He went out. He closed the door. He went to the storage room. The children had woken up. Breakfast, bread, porridge, water, routine. Lily looked at his face and understood. She turned away and began sweeping the floor, furiously, as if the broom were to blame. Finn didn't understand. He asked where Martha was. Eli said Martha had left. Finn asked where. Eli said far away. Mia walked up to him and took his hand. She just stood next to him and held his hand, without saying a word, as always. He looked down at her, a 6-year-old girl who doesn't speak. She stands there holding his hand because she senses he's not feeling well. That's when he started crying. Not loudly, silently. The tears just flowed. He stood in the middle of the warehouse and cried while Mia held his hand and Lily swept the floor without turning around, and Finn stood in the corner not understanding what was happening, and Tom and Emma sat on the cots and watched. He cried for 3 minutes. Then he wiped his face with a handkerchief. He blew his nose. He took a deep breath. He exhaled. And he said there was a lot to do today. Gregor organized the funeral. The old man knew people. He found a spot on a hill outside town, under an oak tree. Martha loved oak trees. She used to say that oak trees have the most honest roots. They don't play tricks. They just grow deep into the ground. 7 people came. Eli, 6 children, Gregor, Barrow, the mother of the boy Eli had cured during his first week, 3 more women from the port who used to buy his ointments, 11 people at the funeral of an old woman who had lived 71 years and carried within her a secret that could have turned the world upside down. 11. Eli thought it was unfair. Then he thought that 11 was better than nothing. He stood by the grave and said nothing. He didn't give a eulogy. He didn't know what to say. Gregor said a few words. That Martha had been a good person. Quiet. Kind. That she never refused to help anyone. That the world had become a smaller place without her. Barrow stood to the side and took off his hat. Lily stood at the very edge of the grave and looked down. Her face was stony. Not a single tear, but her fists were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. When it was all over, Eli returned to the storeroom. He sat down at the table. Martha's herbs lay on the table. He sorted through them and thought. She had called him the keeper. She had entrusted him with a tradition 300 years old. She had asked him to carry it on. He looked around the storeroom, at the sleeping platforms, at the stove, at the children, at the pots of ointments, at the trays of flatbreads. He looked at the piece of paper in his pocket. I'm sorry I didn't ask. He took it out, smoothed it out, laid it on the table. He took a piece of charcoal from the stove and wrote 2 words on the back of the paper. Martha's house. In the morning, he nailed the piece of paper above the storeroom door. Lily read it. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. But that evening, when a woman came to her for bread, Lily said, "This is Martha's house. We help people here. Would you like bread or ointment?" The woman looked at the sign, at the girl, at the storeroom behind her from which the scent of bread and herbs wafted, and where Finn's laughter and the crackling of the stove could be heard. She bought some bread, and she told her neighbor. The neighbor told a friend. Within a week, the whole harbor district knew about Martha's house, not as a shelter, as a place where a young boy treats people for a few coins, bakes bread with herbs, and takes in children who have no one. A strange place, a puzzling one, but a real one. On the 9th day after the funeral, a woman came, not for bread and not for ointment. She came for a different kind of help. Her name was Rena, 30 years old, a widow. Her husband had died on a fishing boat a year ago. 2 children, a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. Rena worked at a textile factory, 14 hours a day for 10 kopecks. She left the children with a neighbor. The neighbor charged 5 kopecks to watch them. That left 5, for the 3 of them. Rena stood at the door and said this in an even voice, without complaint, no tears, like a report. She asked if she could leave the children here while she worked. She'd pay 3 kopecks a day. Eli looked at her, then at the 2 little ones hiding behind her skirt. The boy looked at him curiously. The girl was sucking her thumb. He said, "For free." Rena blinked. She asked again. He repeated himself, "For free." She stood there looking at him, trying to figure out the catch. Nothing in this world was free. You paid for everything, with gold or your body or your soul. A boy in ragged clothes was offering to watch her children for free. It was a trap. It had to be a trap. Eli saw that thought in her eyes. He said there was no trap, that Martha's house was a place where people helped each other, that the children would be fed and kept safe, that he wasn't asking for anything in return. Rena brought the children the next day, in the morning, at dawn. The boy's name was Derek. The girl's name was Nora. Lily looked at them as if they were 2 new problems. Then she took Nora by the hand and led her to the stove. Mia showed Derek her spot by the wall. Derek sat down and began playing with the pebbles Mia had collected on the shore. A week later, Rena started bringing 2 copper coins in the evenings, not for babysitting, for bread, for herself and the children for dinner. Eli didn't take the money. She left it on the table. He found it in the morning. That, too, became a ritual. 2 weeks later, Rena came by in the evening and stayed. She didn't go home. She said she'd been evicted. The landlord raised the rent. She couldn't afford it. Eli set up another cot. 9 people in the warehouse. Rena started helping out. She knew how to sew. Well, quickly, neatly. She mended the children's clothes. Then she mended Eli's clothes. Then she started taking custom orders. The dock workers' wives brought in their husbands' torn shirts. Rena mended them for 2 kopecks. The money went into a shared jar. Eli didn't ask for it. Rena put the first coins in herself and said, "This is our home, not yours, ours." Eli nodded. She was right. 10 sparks burned in his chest, 4 from those he knew by name, 6 from customers and patients. Quiet, small. Gratitude for bread, for ointment, for a kind word. Each carried an imprint within it, a memory, pain. He felt them at night. When he fell asleep, they whispered, not with words, with sensations. The laundress's exhaustion, the fisherman's longing for his son who sailed away and never returned, the shame of a mother who couldn't feed her child. 10 strangers' pains inside him. He was getting used to it, just as he had gotten used to it at the hospice. Carrying someone else's grief doesn't mean drowning in it. It means making room for it, acknowledging it, and moving on. The 3rd month brought Han Cho. She appeared in the doorway of Martha's house at noon. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short black hair and hands that were bigger than barrows. She wore a blacksmith's jacket scorched in 3 places and pants tucked into heavy boots, a bag on her back, a hammer in her hand, a real blacksmith's hammer. She stood in the doorway, blocking the light. Lily looked up at her and asked if she wanted bread or ointment. Hannah said she needed a roof over her head, work, food, in that order. Lily asked what she could do. Hannah lifted the hammer with one hand and rested it on her shoulder. Lily turned to Eli and said, "He's over here." Eli stepped out from behind the table where he'd been grinding herbs. He looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at him. From top to bottom, she was a head taller than him. She asked if this was the boy who healed people for coins. Eli said yes. She asked if it was true that they took everyone here. Eli said it was true. She said, "All right," and went inside. Hana told her story that evening, briefly, without unnecessary words. She was the daughter of a blacksmith from Oldstone, a town 2 days' journey to the west. Her father had taught her to forge since she was 5. She loved fire and metal. She loved the smell of red-hot iron. She loved the moment when a shapeless lump under the hammer became something, a horseshoe, a knife, a door latch. She was skilled, better than her older brother. Her father knew it. But her father decided that a blacksmith's daughter was a commodity, not a craftswoman. He found her a husband, a hardware merchant, 52 years old, 3 ex-wives. Hannah told her father she wouldn't go. Her father said she would. Hannah took a hammer and left that night. She walked for 2 days. She arrived in Bryn Mawr. She heard about Martha's house. She went there. She told the story in an even voice, as if she were talking about someone else. But Eli could see. Her hands were clenched around the hammer's handle so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes stared unblinkingly into the fire in the stove. She was 19 years old and had just lost the only home she'd ever known. Eli said the hammer would come in handy here, that he needed hinges for new doors, hooks, nails, that if she was willing to work, there would be plenty of work. Hannah looked at him. She just asked a question. He asked, "What else?" She said that usually people want something in return. He said he needed nails. That was the return. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she laughed, loudly, in a deep voice, so loud that Mia flinched and Finn jumped. Her laughter was like a hammer striking an anvil, ringing and heavy. She said, "All right, boy, you'll get your nails." They built the smithy behind the warehouse wall, or rather, Hannah built it. Eli helped. Gregor gave the orders. A shed made of planks, an anvil made of flat stone. Not a real anvil, but it was enough for small jobs. A bellows made of clay and stones. Hannah made the bellows herself, from old leather and wooden slats. They bought coal from a merchant at the market. It was expensive, 10 copper coins per sack, but Hannah could make 40 copper coins worth of work from a single sack of coal. Nails, hooks, hinges, knives, simple, sturdy things for simple, sturdy people. She worked quickly and precisely. The hammer sang in her hands. Eli stood nearby watching, and once he told her that she was beautiful when she worked. He said it without thinking, just like he'd tell the nurses at the hospice that they were doing a great job. Just a fact. Hannah stood at the anvil, covered in soot, sweat on her forehead. Her hair stuck to her temples, her apron scorched. She froze. The hammer stopped in midair. She turned her head and looked at him. He was already walking away. He didn't see her face. He didn't see how she blushed from her collarbones to the roots of her hair. He didn't see how she lowered the hammer and stood there for 5 minutes watching him walk away. Lily saw. Lily always saw. She stood around the corner and watched. Then she walked up to Hannah and said that he was like that with everyone, that it didn't mean anything. Hannah looked at the 12-year-old girl with gray eyes. Lily looked up at her, without anger, with a warning. Hannah crouched down in front of her. She asked, "Are you protecting him?" Lily said, "No, just keeping you informed." Hannah laughed again. 20 sparks. They were building up. Every day someone said thank you to him and meant it. The baker at the market to whom Eli returned a wallet he'd found on the sidewalk. The old woman whom he helped carry her basket home. The young errand boy to whom he gave a flatbread when he was sitting by the fountain, hungry. Little sparks, tiny ones, but they added up. 20 little flames in his chest. 20 other people's lives, 20 expressions of gratitude, and 20 pains. He was sleeping worse and worse, not because of nightmares, because of other people's dreams. In his sleep, he saw other people's lives, in bits and pieces, fragments. A woman washes clothes in a cold river and cries from exhaustion. A man carries a log on his shoulder and feels his spine creak. A girl sits in a dark room, waiting for them to come for her. A boy runs down the street laughing, unaware that his mother will die tomorrow. 20 dreams every night. He woke up exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. Martha had warned him, every spark is someone else's pain. The more sparks, the more voices. He endured.
just as he had endured it at the hospice. He'd get up, knead dough, bake bread, heal people, keep going. One morning, Lily found him sitting by the stove with his eyes open. He hadn't slept all night. She sat down beside him, in silence. 10 minutes later, she said he had dark circles under his eyes like a raccoon. He asked how she knew what a raccoon was. She didn't answer, but Eli smiled, for the first time in 3 days. Hannah fit right into the house. She was loud, straightforward. She ate enough for 3. She laughed so hard the walls shook. She cursed when she burned herself at the forge. She sang while she forged, in a low, throaty voice. The songs were blacksmith songs, rhythmic to the beat of the hammer. At first, the children were afraid of her. Then they got used to her. Then they grew to love her. Mia began to sit by the forge and watch Hannah work. Finn helped pump the bellows. Tom carried coal. Emma gathered the cooled metal scraps and built little towers out of them. Hannah watched this, and her loud voice softened. She never yelled at the children, not once. Eli noticed this. The woman who could outshout a storm spoke to the children softly, as if they were made of glass. He understood why when Hannah told him one evening that her father had beaten her older brother, not her. He didn't beat her because she was merchandise, and merchandise mustn't be damaged, but she heard it, every night, through the wall. And she swore she would never, never raise a hand against a child. Not even her voice, not even a whisper. 12 people at Martha's house. Eli, Lily, Finn, Mia, Tom, Emma, Rena with Derek and Nora, Hannah, and 2 more. An old man named Gus. A former sailor, 1 leg, lost the other in a storm 10 years ago. He lived on handouts. He came for ointment for phantom pains in his missing leg. He stayed. He mended fishing nets right there in the house, earned his pennies. And a woman named Beth, 40 years old, a former laundress. Her hands had been eaten away by lye down to the flesh. She couldn't work anymore. Eli made her an ointment, a special one. He spent 3 days perfecting the formula. Her hands didn't heal completely, but enough for her to knead dough. Beth stood by the oven next to Eli and took on half the baking. 12 people, a bakery, a blacksmith shop, a sewing workshop, a rope-making workshop, a pharmacy. Martha's house was growing, not because Eli had planned it that way, but because people came and stayed, because they had nowhere else to go, and because here they were fed and asked for nothing in return except one thing: do what you can for those around you. In the 4th month, Eli heard the word inquisition for the first time. It happened at the market. He was standing by his crate of flatbreads and ointments. Lily was selling nearby. 2 women stopped at the neighboring stall and were talking. One said that in Rinmark, a town to the south, the Inquisition of Silence had taken a boy, a gifted one, 10 years old. His spark had manifested without a ritual. He'd healed a goat with a touch. He simply laid his hands on it, and the goat stopped limping. The Inquisition came on the 3rd day. They took the boy away. His mother screamed. The neighbors stood and watched. The second woman shook her head and said that it was always like that. That the Church of the Scales would not tolerate those who did not pay for their gift. That the law of the seal was the law. That the boy was to blame. The first woman objected. She said the boy hadn't done anything, that he hadn't healed the goat on purpose, that the spark had just come out on its own. The second woman shrugged and walked away. Eli stood there listening. His hands stopped arranging the flatbreads. The Inquisition of Silence. He'd heard that name before. Martha had mentioned it, in passing, without details. A squad from the Church of the Scales, specializing in tracking down and seizing those who manifest the gift without a ritual. Seizure, a beautiful word. It means that people in white cloaks come for you and you disappear. He looked at Lily. She had heard it too. Her gray eyes were no longer angry. They were frightened. It was the first time he'd seen fear in Lily's eyes. She asked quietly, "They'll come for us." Eli didn't answer right away. He was thinking. 20 sparks, accepted without a ritual, without gold, without the church. In the eyes of the law of the seal, he was a criminal, a heretic, worse than a thief, worse than a murderer. Because a thief steals a wallet, but a heretic steals a monopoly. He told Lily that not yet, that Bryn Mawr was a small port, that rumors spread slowly, that they had time. He didn't know how much, but he knew they couldn't hide forever. Martha's house was becoming too conspicuous. Too many people knew about the boy who healed without a doctor, who baked bread with herbs, who took in orphans. Sooner or later, the rumors would reach someone who wanted to profit from turning him in. He returned to the house and gathered everyone. 12 people in one room. He told them what he'd heard at the market. No panic, no drama, just the facts. There's an organization. It's looking for people like him. If they find him, things will go badly. We need to be more careful. Hannah said she could protect the house, that she had a hammer. Eli shook his head. A hammer against the Inquisition is like a stone against a storm. It won't help. They don't need strength. They need to stay under the radar. Rena said she could help. She'd overheard conversations at the weaving factory. There's a man at the port who makes fake documents for money, licenses, guild insignias. If Dom Marta has an official herbalism license from the Port Guild, the church won't be able to just take Eli away. It would take a trial, and a trial takes time. Eli looked at Rena, a widow, 30 years old, quiet, unobtrusive, and here she was, offering to forge documents as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He asked how much such a license would cost. Rena said 2 gold pieces. Silence. 2 gold pieces is 200 copper coins. That's 10 days' worth of Martha's house's revenue. If they don't eat, if they don't buy flour, if they don't buy coal, just 10 days of starvation. Lily said she could get the money. Eli looked at her. She was looking him in the eyes, without blinking, gray eyes, steady. She was thinking of stealing. He said no. Lily opened her mouth to argue. He repeated himself, no, calmly, without anger, but in a way that made Lily shut her mouth. She sat there, biting her lip, hating him for that no. And at the same time, she knew he was right. Stealing would draw attention. Attention leads to guards. Guards lead to questions. Questions lead to the Inquisition. Eli said they'd earn money, legally, in a month. Hannah makes knives. Knives cost more than nails. Rena sews. Beth bakes. He makes ointments. Lily sells them. Everyone works. All together, 2 gold pieces a month. The hardest month began. Every day from dawn till dusk. Eli baked bread. He made ointments. He walked around the port offering his tinctures to tavern keepers and ship captains. The seasickness tincture turned out to be a hit. Sailors paid 5 copper coins for a pot. Eli prepared 10 a day. Lily stood at the market for 12 hours. She sold like a woman possessed. She shouted, called out to customers, haggled, and hurried them along. Finn delivered orders to customers' addresses. He ran around town with a sack on his back. Mia helped Rena sew, not with words, with her hands. Her little fingers were nimble and precise. She handed the thread. She held the fabric. Rena was amazed and shook her head. Hannah forged knives, 3 a day. Simple, sturdy, with wooden handles. 8 copper coins per knife. The porters bought them eagerly. Tom helped her at the forge. Emma played with Derek and Nora in the corner and didn't get in the way. Gus knitted nets faster than usual. Beth baked flatbreads while Eli was on his rounds. 12 people worked like a single machine. The copper coins flowed into a tin can. Every evening, Lily counted them. The first week, 47 copper coins. The second, 610. Third, 73. People came, not just for goods, for a word. Eli noticed this. A porter would come in for ointment but stay for 10 minutes and talk about his sick wife. A shopkeeper would come for bread but sit by the stove, silent, just warming her hands. A young errand boy would run in and ask if there was any work. There wasn't any work, but Eli would give him a flatbread, and the boy would leave with his back a little straighter. Every conversation, every thank you, little sparks. By the middle of the month, he had 35. In the 4th week, Lily counted the jar and said, 2 gold pieces and 3 copper coins. They'd done it. Rena left in the morning and returned at dinner time with a leather scroll. A license from the Bryn Mawr City Herbalists Guild, issued to Eli North, with a seal, signed, forged but convincing. Eli unrolled the scroll. He looked at it, his first official document in this world. A forgery, but a document nonetheless. He hung it on the wall above the table with the herbs, next to the piece of paper that read, Martha's House. Now they had a name and a piece of paper. It wouldn't protect them from the Inquisition forever, but it would buy them time, and time was all he needed. Because every day, Martha's house grew. Every day, someone new said thank you. Every day, another spark, another person, another thread in the web that was becoming a net. That evening, he sat on the roof of the warehouse, alone. His legs dangled over the edge. Below, the sea roared. Above his head, the stars. Strange stars from a strange world. 35 sparks burned quietly and steadily in his chest. 35 strangers' lives. 35 stories. 35 pains. He closed his eyes and felt them all, every single one. Barrow, who snores in his house by the docks and dreams of the sea as it was when he was young.
Renu, who was sleeping soundly for the first time in a year because her children are close by and warm. The dock worker from the third pier whose back no longer aches thanks to the ointment and who, today for the first time in a month, lifted his daughter into his arms. The market vendor who is no longer afraid to leave her home because there is now a place in the port where she is called by name. He felt them all, and they all felt him. Not consciously, not magically, just somewhere deep inside, each of them knew there was a boy in the warehouse by the sea who remembered their names. Celeste morning arrived in the 5th month, but first winter came. The Bryn Mawr winter was wet, no snow, rain, cold, endless, gray sky, gray sea, gray city. The temperature dropped, not drastically, but enough for the children to feel the cold. The stove burned round the clock. The firewood ran out faster than Eli could gather it on the shore. The driftwood got soggy and burned poorly. The smoke stung their eyes. Eli bought real firewood. It was expensive, 8 copper coins per bundle. The budget was stretched thin. Kana started forging more. Lily haggled harder. Rena sewed faster. But winter devoured money like fire devours dry wood. Mia was the first to get sick. A cold, fever, cough. Eli treated her himself. Thyme infusion, mint, warm water, compresses. For 3 days she lay on the cot, wrapped in blankets, and looked at him with her big dark eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't complain, she just lay there and watched. Lily didn't leave her side. She slept next to her, held her hand. Lily, who claimed that Mia was a fool and a burden, didn't let go of her hand for 12 hours straight. On the 4th day, Mia got up, pale, thin, but alive. Lily pretended she didn't care. Mia took her hand and didn't let go until evening. Then Finn got sick. Then Derek. Then Emma. Then Nora. A wave of colds swept through the house like a storm along the shore. Eli treated everyone, one by one, without sleep. For 3 days straight, he didn't sleep at all. He prepared herbal infusions. He changed compresses. He spoon-fed the sick. Rena helped. Beth helped. Hannah made broth from bones she'd begged from the butcher. Gus told the children stories about the sea so they wouldn't cry. Martha's house survived the winter. Everyone survived. No one died. It was a miracle. A small, quiet miracle wrought by the hands of a skinny teenager with 35 foreign sparks in his chest. Celeste appeared at the end of the 5th month. It had been raining non-stop for 3 days. The streets of Bryn Mawr had turned into rivers of mud. The port was deserted. Trade had come to a standstill. Eli sat in the house, mending a net for Gus. His hands knew the rope, the fisherman's spark he'd received a week earlier from an old man at the market. The door opened. A girl stood in the doorway, 16 years old, short, thin, soaked to the bone. Her dark red hair was plastered to her face. Her clothes were expensive but dirty and torn. A coat made of fine wool with a silver clasp, leather boots but caked with mud up to her ankles. She stood in the doorway, shivering, not from the colds but from something else. Lily stepped between her and Eli, out of habit. Any stranger is a threat until proven otherwise. The girl looked down at Lily. She straightened up, lifted her chin, and spoke in a voice that nearly made Lily crouch, clear, steady, with an aristocratic diction that made every word sound like a line from a royal decree. She said her name was Celeste Morning, that she was the daughter of Baron Morning of Ashfield, that she'd traveled 5 days on foot, that she needed shelter, and that if this boy was really the one the rumors were about, she needed to speak with him. Lily wasn't impressed. She said this wasn't a hotel, that if she needed a room, she should go to the tavern. Celeste looked at her and said she had no money. Lily raised an eyebrow. The Baron's daughter without money. Celeste said that when you leave home for good, money is the last thing on your mind. Eli stood up. He walked over. He looked at her, wet, shivering, with her chin up and fear in her eyes. A familiar fear. The fear of someone who's done something irreversible and doesn't know what will happen next. He said, "Come in." Lily looked at him with an expression that said, "We'll talk about this later." Celeste went inside. She sat down by the stove. She took a mug of hot tea. She drank in silence. Her hands were shaking so much that the tea spilled. Hannah gave her some dry clothes, her own, 3 sizes too big. In Hannah's blacksmith's jacket, Celeste looked like a child in her father's coat. That evening, she told her story. Not everything, but enough. Her father, Baron Morning, bought sparks. Not through the church, on the black market, from the dying. He would visit the sick, the elderly, and the poor. He offered gold, Not much, just enough for the family to bury the deceased. In exchange, he took a spark. Through a ritual performed by a hired priest, the dying person gave up their gift. Not voluntarily, under pressure, under blackmail. What will happen to your family when you die? Who will pay for the funeral? Who will feed the children? Sign the paper. Give up the spark. Get the gold. Celeste found out by accident. She found records in her father's office. Lists, names, amounts, dates. 117 names over 3 years. 117 sparks bought from the dying. She went to her father and asked what it was. He said it was business, that sparks were a resource, that someone had to collect them before they disappeared, that the dying didn't care. They didn't need them anymore. Celeste said it was murder. Not literally, but murder. To take a person's best part away before they die, to leave them empty, without a gift, without what made them who they were. Her father said she was naive. That's just how the world works, that when she grew up, she'd understand. She left that night. She took a coat and boots and nothing else. She walked for 5 days. Along the way, she heard stories about a boy at the port who heals people for coins, who takes in orphans into his home, who says thank you to the elderly and bows first. The rumors were strange, warm, not like rumors, more like the truth that people whisper to each other because they're afraid that if they say it out loud, it will disappear. Celeste didn't come here because she had nowhere else to go. She did have a place to go. She had relatives, acquaintances. She came because she wanted to see if it was true, if there really was a place where people helped just because. She sat by the stove in a stranger's jacket and watched Eli. He was sitting on the floor, mending Finn's boot. The sole had come unstuck. He was tying it back on with a piece of string, crooked, clumsily, but carefully. A 14-year-old boy was mending a 9-year-old boy's boot by the light of the stove in an abandoned warehouse he called home. Celeste watched him, and something changed in her eyes. She asked if he was really the one they were talking about. He replied that it depended on what they were saying. She said they were saying he was a saint. He said he wasn't a saint, that he just baked bread. She said that made him a very strange baker. He agreed. Lily snorted from her corner. Celeste stayed. The next day she began to write. Not poetry, not a diary. Letters. She had clear, neat handwriting, impeccable grammar, and a thorough knowledge of etiquette and courtly formulae. She wrote 3 letters on the first day. Recipients: the Bryn Mawr Merchants Guild, the Port Magistrate, the Healers Guild in Renmark. Content: an official request to register Martha's House as a medical and craft guild, with the right to trade, with the right to teach, with the right to take in orphans. Eli read the letters. Then he read them again. Then he looked at Celeste. She sat as straight as a ruler and looked at him with an expression that said, "Well, what now?" He asked how she knew this. She said she'd grown up in the Baron's house, that paperwork was the only weapon that worked against the authorities. Not swords, not hammers, paperwork, seals, signatures, laws. She knows how the system works, from the inside, and she can use that for House Martha. Eli looked at her, the Baron's 16-year-old daughter. She'd run away from home. She came to the slums, and on her very first day, she did more for the house than Eli had in a month. He said thank you. Celeste turned away, quickly, but he managed to see her lips tremble. She wasn't used to that word, not to the word itself, to the way he said it, without conditions, without expectations, just thank you. Because you're here, because you did that, because you're one of us. That evening, Lily approached Eli and said she didn't like the aristocrat. Eli asked why. Lily said she was too smart, that you can't trust smart people. Eli asked, "Can you trust me?" Lily was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I can trust you. You're not smart, you're kind." Those are different things. He didn't argue. In the 6th month, a ship arrived from Kairos, a big one, a 3-masted ship, with a black hull and red sails. It docked at the far pier at dawn. Eli saw it from the warehouse window when he went out to get water. The ship was beautiful, predatory, like a shark in a school of herring. The harbor boys were already milling around it. Sailors were coming down the gangplank. They didn't look like the ones from Bryn Mawr. They were dark-skinned, with curved knives at their belts, with eyes that assessed everything around them as merchandise. Eli stood there with his bucket and watched. Something tightened inside him. Not sparks. Instinct. The kind that kicks in when you see a predator in a herd. He went back to the house, told Lily not to let the kids go to the harbor today. Lily asked why. He said it was a Kairos ship. Lily didn't argue. She'd seen those ships before, too. She knew what they brought in, and what they took away. For 3 days, the ship had been docked at the pier, being unloaded. Spices, silk, wine, all expensive, all legal. On the 4th day, Barrow came by for some ointment and told him, quietly, glancing around. He said that at night he'd seen them unloading not boxes from the ship, people, bags that were moving, 5 or 6, small ones, children's. They were lowered over the side and loaded onto a cart. The cart headed for the warehouses on the west side of the port. Barrow said he hadn't seen anything, that he didn't need any trouble, that he had a family. Eli nodded. He understood. Barrow stood up. He looked at Eli. He said just one thing, warehouse number 17, west side, and he left. Eli stood by the table with the herbs and thought, children in sacks, slave traders from Kairos, warehouse number 17. He could have walked right past it. That would have been the sensible thing to do. He had 12 people under his roof. Martha's house was just getting back on its feet. The license, Celeste's letters, a first taste of stability. One careless move and it would all come crashing down. He could have walked right past it. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. By the 4th second, he already knew he wouldn't walk past it. Just as he hadn't walked past Martha. Just as he hadn't walked past the boy with the cough. Just as he hadn't walked past the hospice. Physically impossible. He called a meeting. Not everyone. Hannah, Lily, Celeste, Rena stayed with the children. The 4 of them sat at the table by candlelight. Eli shared what he knew. Hannah said she'd go there and smash the heads of everyone who trafficked children. Eli said no, that there were guards there, that they'd be killed, that they needed a clever plan. Celeste thought for a minute, then she spoke up. She said the Kairos traffickers had a weak spot, the paperwork. To import live cargo, you need a declaration and a port seal. Without it, the cargo is illegal. Illegal cargo can be confiscated, but it's not the guards who confiscate it. The guards have been bribed. It's the port official who applies the seals who confiscates it. If, for some reason, that official loses the declaration, the cargo is left in limbo. Without the documents, it can't be sold, shipped out, or even stored. The merchants would have to either abandon it or take a risk and transport it without the paperwork. And without the paperwork, they'll be intercepted at the very first checkpoint outside the city. Eli asked how to make the official lose the declaration. Celeste said there was no need to force him. You just have to ask, politely, with a good reason. She knew this official. His name was Holt, a small man in a minor position. His wife is sick, 3 children, a salary of 20 copper coins a week. He's not a bad guy, he just turns a blind eye because that's what he's paid to do. Eli asked how much the merchants paid him. Celeste said she didn't know, but she knew what he was missing, medicine for his wife. She asked Eli if he could make the medicine. Eli said it depended on the illness. In the morning, he went to see Holt, alone. He found him in his office at the 3rd pier. A small office, dusty files, an inkwell, a seal. Holt was a short, stooped man with tired eyes. He looked at Eli and asked what he wanted. Eli said he'd heard that his wife was sick, that he was an herbalist, that he could help, for free. Holt looked at him suspiciously. Eli took a small pot of ointment out of his bag, a special one. He'd been preparing it all night. Martha had taught him this recipe in her final days, an ointment for joint fever, a complex one. 7 herbs. Moon root, fir oil, honey, steeped for 3 days. Eli handed the jar to Holt. He told him to rub it on his joints in the morning and at night. It would get better in a week. Holt took the jar. He looked at it, then at Eli. He asked what he wanted in return. Eli said nothing. Holt didn't believe him. Eli said he was serious, that he just wanted to help, that he had 12 people at Martha's house and he knew what it was like when a loved one was sick and there was no money. Holt was silent. Then he put the little pot away in a desk drawer. He said thank you, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but Eli felt it, a tiny spark, warm, sad. The spark of a man who was tired of being invisible. Eli didn't ask Holt for anything. He left. He returned to the house. Celeste asked, "Well?" He said he'd given him the ointment. She asked, "What about the declaration?" He said he hadn't asked for it. Celeste looked at him as if he'd just thrown their only chance into the sea. He said that if he asked for it right away, it would be a deal, and Holt makes deals every day.
With merchants, with smugglers, one more deal won't change anything. He has to want it himself. Celeste opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said it was either genius or hopelessly stupid. A week passed. Eli brought Holt a second jar. He asked how his wife was doing. Holt said she was better, that the pain was gone, that for the first time in half a year she'd slept through the night. His voice trembled. Eli left the ointment and left. On the 10th day, Holt came on his own, to Martha's house. He stood by the door, crumpling his hat in his hands. He looked at the storeroom, at the children, at the stove, at the flatbreads, at the herbs, at Hannah by the forge, at Lily, who was counting copper coins, at Miha, who was sitting by the window and drawing with her finger on the fogged-up glass. Holt looked at all of this and said that the Cairo ship had no declaration for 6 units of cargo, that he had checked, that the documents were incomplete, that, by law, such cargo was subject to, that tomorrow morning he would conduct an inspection, an official one, with 2 witnesses, and if anyone happened to be near warehouse number 17 at that moment, the confiscated cargo would have to be taken somewhere. Holt put on his hat and left. Eli stood by the door and watched him go. Celeste stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said quietly, "You didn't ask him to come. He came on his own." Eli nodded. In the morning, they were at warehouse 17. Eli, Hannah with a sledgehammer, Lily, and Holt with 2 port guards who owed him a favor. The door was opened. Inside, it smelled of urine and fear. 6 children, aged 5 to 12, tied to posts, gagged, dirty, thin. Their eyes were huge. Among them was a girl, older than the rest, 17 years old, with a brand on her collarbone, letters that Eli couldn't read, Kairos letters. She wasn't tied up. She was sitting against the wall, holding the hand of the youngest, a 5-year-old boy who had stopped crying, who was silent with a silence worse than a scream. Eli walked over. He sat down in front of her. She looked at him, black eyes, empty, scorched, the eyes of someone who had seen rock bottom and wasn't sure they'd made it back up. He said 3 words, "You're safe." She didn't believe him. Of course she didn't. Why should she? But the youngest boy reached out his hands to Eli. Because children sense things, not words, not promises. Warmth. Eli picked him up. The boy pressed himself against him and closed his eyes. The girl with the brand watched this, and something stirred in her empty eyes. Not hope yet. A shadow of hope. The first shadow in a long time. Her name was Soyeon Park. Soyeon hadn't spoken for 3 days. She sat in a corner of Martha's house. She didn't eat, she didn't drink, she didn't sleep. She just sat there, staring at the wall. Eli didn't touch her. He didn't approach her. He didn't ask questions. He knew. There were children at the hospice who came from places from which one doesn't return right away. Sometimes they don't return at all. The only thing he did was set a mug of tea next to her. Every evening. Warm, with mint. He'd set it on the floor a step away from her and leave. In the morning, the mug was still in the same spot. Full, untouched. He didn't take it away. He set a new one next to it. On the 3rd evening, she picked up the mug. She didn't drink it. She just held it in her hands, warming her palms. On the 4th evening, she drank half of it. On the 5th, she drank it all. On the 6th day, Eli set the mug down, and she drank it 6th day. Eli set the mug down, and she said, "Thank you." 1 word. Quiet. In a language he didn't know. But he understood. Some words don't need to be translated. The 6 rescued children settled in quickly. Children are resilient. They bend but don't break. The youngest, whose name was Pim, clung to Hannah. He followed her around like a shadow. He sat by the forge while she hammered. He fell asleep by the anvil. At first, Hannah grumbled. Then she got used to it. Then she started talking to him while she worked. She explained what she was doing. This is a nail. This is a hinge. This is how you strike it while it's hot. See the sparks? They're beautiful. Pim nodded. His eyes were round and shiny. He looked at Hannah as if she were a giantess from a fairy tale, a kind giantess who clangs and sparkles but never hurts anyone. By the end of the 2nd week, Soyeon began to move around the house, slowly,
carefully, like someone who's relearning how to take up space. She watched everyone. Eli kneading dough, Lily counting copper coins, Rena sewing, Celeste writing letters. She didn't ask anything, she just watched. She memorized everything. In the third week, she approached Celeste. Celeste was writing yet another letter to the Merchants Guild. Soyeon stood beside her. She looked at the text and said that the third paragraph contained a grammatical error. Celeste looked up. She looked at Soyeon, then at the text. She found the error. She looked at Soyeon again. She asked how she knew Aurelian grammar. Soyeon replied that she knew 5 languages, that before her enslavement, she had been an ambassador's daughter. That language was the first thing taught in diplomatic families. Celeste was silent for a second. Then she pulled out a chair. Soyeon sat down. They worked together until evening. 2 young women at one table, an aristocrat and a former slave. One knew how power worked from the inside. The other knew how the world worked from the bottom up. Together, they were dangerous. For those accustomed to the idea that those at the bottom never rise, Soyeon began to help with the management. Quietly, unobtrusively. She calculated faster than Lily. Her handwriting was neater than Celeste's. She knew the trade laws of the 3 kingdoms. She knew how to keep records, how to allocate supplies, how to plan expenses a month in advance. Eli looked at her and thought the universe had a strange sense of humor. He had saved a slave, and she turned out to be the best manager of anyone he'd ever met in both his lives. A month later, Martha's house was running like a well-oiled machine. Not because Eli was in charge, but because Soyeon had assigned roles. Morning baking, Beth and Eli. Afternoon sales, Lily and Finn. The blacksmith shop, Hannah and Tom. Sewing and repairs, Rena. Herbs and ointments, Eli and 2 of the rescued children he'd begun teaching. Letters and documents, Celeste and Soyeon. Looking after the little ones, Mia and Emma. Gus. Barrow, who came in the evenings to help with the heavy work. 20 people, everyone in their place. Everyone doing what they know how to do. Toward the end of the 6th month, Soyeon did something Eli hadn't expected. She came to him that evening. He was sitting on the roof, looking out at the sea. She sat down beside him, in silence, for a long time. Then she spoke. She told him about her sister, her younger sister, Min, 14 years old. They'd been together on the ship. Min didn't survive the crossing. She fell ill. Fever, delirium. Soyeon held her for 3 days. On the 4th day, Min stopped breathing. The traders threw her body overboard. Soyeon watched as her sister disappeared into the black water. And ever since then, she hasn't been able to be happy. She doesn't have the right to be, because Min can't. Eli listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say that everything would be all right. He didn't promise that the pain would go away. He knew it wouldn't. At the hospice, he'd seen parents lose their children. That pain doesn't go away. It changes form. It grows quieter, but it doesn't go away. He said only one thing, that Min wouldn't want Soyeon to stop living. That if Min could see her now, she'd want Soyeon to drink tea and eat bread. And laugh when Hana drops the hammer on her foot and curses in 3 languages. Soyeon was silent. Then she said he was strange, that she didn't understand him, that he was a 14-year-old boy but spoke like an old man who had seen too many deaths. Eli didn't answer, because she was right. They sat on the roof and were silent. 2 people who had lost too much, one in a past life, the other in this one. A week later, Eli found a mug of tea on his desk, warm with mint. He looked at Soyeon. She was sitting in her corner, reading a letter. She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth twitched. He drank the tea. He said nothing. That was the beginning. A year, exactly a year since that night when he woke up in a Bryn Mawr alley. Eli stood by the window of Martha's house and counted. Not coins, people. 3 houses, Bryn Mawr, Oldstone, Renmark. Bryn Mawr house has 22 people. Hannah opened the Oldstone house. She returned to her hometown not as a blacksmith's daughter, but as a master craftswoman. She found an abandoned barn. She brought 7 people there. She hung up a sign, Martha's house. Rena opened the Renmark house. She left with Derek and Nora. She found a place, a weaving workshop attached to an orphanage. 12 people. 3 houses, 41 people. 150 sparks in Eli's chest. 150 quiet fires. 150 strangers' lives. He slept 2 hours a day. He couldn't manage more. Other people's dreams filled every minute. He saw the faces of people he had never met. He felt pain he had never experienced. He cried in his sleep with strangers' tears. He'd wake up and couldn't tell whose memories they were, his or theirs. Soyeon was the first to notice. She was always the first to notice. She came up to him in the morning while he was kneading dough. She stood beside him. She said he looked like a man carrying a house on his back. He replied that was exactly the case. She said houses are built on foundations, not on shoulders, that he needed to let go, not of people, control. He can't do everything himself. He has to trust. He looked at her. She looked at him. Calmly, steadily. Black eyes. Not empty, not scorched like on that first day in the warehouse. Alive, warm. He nodded. She was right. He began to let go, slowly, bit by bit. He handed the baked goods over to Beth and 2 students. He handed the business over to Lily entirely. He handed the bookkeeping over to Soyeon. He handed the letters over to Celeste. He kept only the herbs for himself, and the people. He couldn't give the people away to anyone, because people came to him, not for bread, not for ointment, for him, for the boy who remembers names. The porter would come after his shift, sit by the stove, stay silent for 10 minutes, and leave. He didn't need words. He needed a place where people knew him. An old woman would bring her grandson to show him to the boy who had healed her knees. The young errand boy would pop in to ask how things were going. Just to ask. Just to hear that everything was all right. That was what Eli couldn't delegate. His presence. The first clash with the Inquisition happened at the end of the first year. They came at night, 3 of them, in gray cloaks, no insignia, no names, quiet, professional. They entered the dockside district and began asking questions about the boy, about Martha's house, about miraculous healings, about sparks without ritual. Lily was the first to find out. Her network of harbor boys worked better than any intelligence agency. She ran into the house, gasping for breath. 3 men in gray. They're asking about you. They're coming this way. Eli stood up. He looked at the house. 22 people, children, women, old people. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Hannah stood by the door with a hammer. Eli said no. Hannah said over her dead body. He said that was exactly what he wanted to avoid. Celeste said she had a license, an official one. Well, almost official. That the Inquisition couldn't just take a licensed herbalist away like that. They'd need an order from the cardinal, or a court ruling, or a charge of heresy backed by 3 witnesses. There was no time. The inquisitors were already on their street. Eli went out, alone. He stood in front of the door. 3 men in gray appeared from around the corner. They stopped. They looked at him. One of them was the senior inquisitor, tall, gray-haired, with a face that betrayed no emotion. He asked Eli North if he could see him. Eli said yes. The senior inquisitor said a report had been filed, that a boy named Eli North was practicing the forbidden transfer of sparks, that the Church of Libra was obligated to investigate, that the boy must go with them for verification. Eli said he wouldn't go anywhere, that he had a license, that he was an herbalist, that he treats people for coins and isn't breaking any rules. The elder looked at him, silently. Then he stepped forward, and just then a door opened behind Eli. Hannah came out, with a hammer. Behind her was Soyeon. Behind her was Celeste, Tom, Finn, Lily with a knife Eli had never seen her hold before, Gus on one leg with a crutch that looked more like a club, Beth with a poker. They stood behind Eli, silently, like a wall. The chief inquisitor looked at them, then back at Eli. Then he turned to the other 2 and said something quietly. They turned and left. Without words, without threats, they simply left. Eli stood and watched them go. His hands were shaking. He pressed them against his sides so no one would see. Hannah placed her hand on his shoulder, heavy, hot from the forge. She said that next time she wouldn't wait for permission. Lily hid the knife. Soyeon stood nearby and said nothing, but she stood there. That was more important than words. That night, Eli sat on the roof and thought, they'll leave, but they'll come back, with greater forces, with orders, with accusations.
The question isn't whether they'll come back. The question is what he'll do when they do. He looked up at the sky. Strange stars. A strange world. 150 sparks in his chest. 150 people who'd said thank you to him. 150 threads. He thought of Martha, of her note. Carry on. He thought of Theo, of the boy from the hospice, of his last thought before dying. He hadn't finished reading the chapter about the dragon. He thought that in that chapter, the dragon didn't win by force. The dragon won because those he protected stood behind him.
He smiled and began to make plans. A year and a half. The village of Littlehaven in the north, 200 residents. There used to be 200. Before the raid by the Kairos raiders, they came at dawn, burned down the barns. They stole the livestock. They took 12 people, young and strong, to sell. They left the rest in the ashes. Eli found out a week later. A messenger from Renmark, a boy from the house there, ran up, gasping for breath. He told him what had happened. Eli got ready in an hour. He took a bag of herbs, a bag of flour, his tools. He said goodbye to the house. Soyeon said she was coming with him. He said the house needed her here. She said the house needed him alive, and that she knew better than he did how to negotiate with people who had lost everything, because she herself had lost everything. He didn't argue. They walked for 4 days. Along the way, Ayla Vesper joined them. She appeared on the second day of their journey. She stepped out from behind the trees onto the road and stood before them. Tall, thin, short, light hair, a long scar across her left cheek from her temple to her chin, leather armor, a sword at her belt, a pipe clenched between her teeth. She said she'd heard about Eli, that she wanted to hire herself out, that she needed food and a roof over her head, that in return she could provide protection, that she was good at protecting people. It was the only thing she knew how to do. Eli looked at her, 22 years old, a former guard, dismissed for refusing to kill a peasant, eyes as gray as lilies, but not angry, empty. The eyes of someone who had stopped believing that loyalty made any sense. He said she'd get food and a roof, that he had nothing to pay her with, that if she was willing to work for it, she was welcome. Isla looked at him, at the sack of flour, at his thin shoulders, at the serious face of a 14-year-old boy who was setting out to rebuild a ruined village with a sack of flour and a bundle of herbs. She took a long drag on her pipe and said, "All right." Littlehaven was dead. Not literally, the people were alive, but the spirit was dead. They sat among the charred logs and stared at the ground. They didn't cry, they didn't argue, they didn't make plans. They just sat there. Eli knew that state. He'd seen it at the hospice. When a person receives a diagnosis, for the first few days, they feel nothing. Emptiness. Then comes the pain. Then anger. Then acceptance. But first, emptiness. He didn't give any speeches. He didn't promise that everything would be all right. He took flour out of the sack, salt, water from the stream. He kneaded the dough, right on the charred plank, with his hands. The 4 sparks worked together. The herbalist knew which herbs to add. The laundress knew the right texture. The stonemason knew how to build a hearth out of stones in 10 minutes. The porter knew how to carry heavy loads without straining his back. He baked flatbreads over the coals, 20 of them, and he began to hand them out, by name. He had asked for their names during the first hour. From each one, he approached them, sat down beside them, asked their names, memorized them. Now he was handing them out. "This one's for you, John. This one's for you, Marie. Take this one to your son while it's still warm." They looked at him, not understanding. A boy in ragged clothes was giving them bread and calling them by name. Who was he? Where was he from? Why? An old man named Alden stood up. He walked over to him and looked down at him. He said he was grateful for the bread. But that bread wouldn't bring back their burned-down houses. Eli said it wouldn't, but that tomorrow morning he'd start building new ones, and that he needed help. Alden looked at him for a long time. Then he said the boy was crazy. Eli agreed. 3 months, 90 days. He worked harder than he ever had in either of his lives. He got up before dawn, hauled logs, hewn planks, kneaded clay. He laid walls. The mason's spark sang in his hands. He didn't build like a master, like an apprentice, but an apprentice with the intuition of a 60-year-old mason. The walls turned out straight, the roofs held up, the stoves didn't smoke. Soyan organized everything else: supplies, the schedule, assigning people. She spoke little. She did a lot. At first, the peasants didn't understand her. A former slave with a brand on her collarbone was giving them orders. But after a week, they understood. She wasn't just giving orders. She saw who was good at what and put each person where they were needed most. Just like Eli with the sparks, only without magic, just intelligence and keen observation. Ayla stood guard. During the day, she patrolled the perimeter. At night, she sat by the campfire, smoking and gazing into the darkness. Her eyes saw better in the dark than anyone else's, a guard's skill. Twice she heard a rustle in the woods. Twice she went out with her sword. Both times it was just foxes. But the village slept more peacefully knowing she was there. On the 40th day, Eli sat by the fire. Peasants sat around him, wounded, tired, but alive, and angry. Anger had replaced the emptiness. That was good. Anger is energy. Energy is movement. Movement is life. Alden sat across from him and looked at Eli through the fire. Then he said he didn't understand. Why was the boy doing this? He wasn't a lord, not a priest, not a relative. Why did he care about a stranger's village? Eli replied that he didn't know, that he simply couldn't do otherwise. Alden was silent. Then he said the boy was either a saint or a fool. Eli said he was more likely a fool. Alden laughed, for the first time in 2 months, and the whole village heard his laughter and looked up. On the 60th day, the village stood. New, not beautiful, a bit crooked, but standing. 12 houses, a barn, a well, a fence. The villagers gathered in the square. Alden stood before Eli. Behind him stood the whole village. They didn't swear an oath to Eli, they swore an oath to one another. Before him, that they would stand together, that they wouldn't let it be burned down again, that each would protect their neighbor. Alden turned to Eli and said thank you. Simply, quietly, the way people say it when they're not used to the word. And 400 sparks burned in Eli's chest. 400 fires. 400 threads. Rumors spread faster than he expected. The boy with the sparks. Who heals? Who builds? Who remembers names? The rumors reached the capital, the palace, the Church of the Scales, Cardinal Ortins. The war began. 2 years and 3 months. The square in front of the Royal Cathedral of the Scales in the capital of Aurelian. White stone. 3 spires, golden scales on each. The square was enormous. It could hold 10,000 people. Today it was empty. Only the wind. Only Eli. He stood in the center, alone, 15 years old. He'd grown in those 2 years. Taller now, broader in the shoulders, but still thin, still with eyes that had seen too much for his age. He was wearing simple clothes. Pants, a shirt, a jacket that Rena had sewn, boots that Hannah had made. In his pocket, a note from Martha, worn thin to the point of transparency. He carried it with him every day. Standing before him was Cardinal Augustus Hortense, 54 years old, tall, lean, dressed in the white robes of the Church of Libra, a golden staff in his hand. Behind him, 1,000 soldiers. The Inquisition of Silence, the Church Guard, steel armor, spears, swords, perfect ranks, professional assassins in white cloaks. Hortense looked at Eli, without hatred, without malice. With the weariness of a man who does what he deems necessary, he spoke, loudly. His voice carried across the empty square and echoed off the cathedral walls. He said that Eli North was accused of heresy of the highest order, of violating the law of the seal, of illegally accepting sparks, of inciting the common people to renounce the ritual, of threatening the foundations of order. Eli listened, silently, without interrupting. Ortons continued speaking. He said that Eli had neither a name nor a lineage nor an army, that he was a boy from the slums, that his houses were a rabble of beggars, thieves, and runaway slaves, that his gift was a disease, not a blessing, that if he wasn't stopped, the world would sink into chaos. He asked who would follow him. Silence. The square was empty. The soldiers stood like a wall. Orton stood before them like a rock. Eli stood alone. A second passed. 2, 3. Then he heard footsteps, not from the soldiers, from the side, from the alley, shuffling, slow. He turned his head. An old man emerged from the alley, alone, with a rusty gaff on his shoulder. Eli didn't recognize him at first. Then he did. The dock worker, from the first month. The one he'd given bread to when he was sitting on the pier, hungry and wet after a night shift. Eli didn't even remember his name. But the dock worker remembered. He remembered the boy who'd given him bread and said, "Here, here, you need it more." The old man crossed the square, silently. He stood next to Eli, turned to face Orton's, the rusty boat hook on his shoulder. Silence. Then more footsteps, from another alley. A woman. The mother of the boy whom Eli had cured with time infusion during the first week. She was leading that very boy by the hand. He was already 8, healthy, rosy-cheeked, full of life. They stood side by side. More footsteps. Barrow, huge, with fists like sledgehammers. Silent. He stood up. More and more, from the alleys, from the doorways, from the windows, from the rooftops. People. They poured out like a river, slowly, quietly, unarmed, without a shout. They simply walked and stood beside him. The laundress he'd helped carry her basket 2 years ago. The baker from whom he'd bought his first flour. The shopkeeper who'd sold him burlap for the windows. The fisherman who'd taught him how to tie knots. The young errand boy to whom he'd given flatbread. Holt, the port official who'd lost the declaration. His wife, healthy, on her own 2 feet. She was carrying a baby in her arms, a new one, born healthy. Gregor, the old mason, on homemade crutches, with trembling hands. He walked across the square as if across a battlefield, and every step cost him all the strength he had left. But he walked. Rena with Derek and Nora. Beth. Gus on one leg. The farmers from Little Haven, Alden in the lead, with an axe on his shoulder. Not a battle axe, a carpenter's axe, the kind he used to chop logs for new houses. They walked and walked, from every street, from every corner. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. People whom Eli had fed, healed, clothed, built homes for, taught their children, mended their shoes, listened to their stories, and remembered their names. They had come. All of them. Hannah stood to Eli's right, a hammer on her shoulder, soot on her face, her eyes ablaze. Lily stood to his left, small, angry, with a knife tucked into her belt. A tin box containing Eli's notes was hidden under her jacket, close to her heart. Celeste stood behind him, upright, chin raised. In her hands, a scroll with the documents she'd been writing for 2 years, every letter like a bullet. Isla stood in front of him, between him and Hortense, a sword in her hand, a scar on her cheek, her eyes calm. She'd finally found something worth standing for. Soyeon stood next to Eli, close, their shoulders touched. She wasn't looking at Hortense, she was looking at Eli, quietly, calmly, with the same expression he'd seen when she poured him tea in the evenings. Mia stood in the crowd, 13 years old, all grown up. She was holding Finn's hand, and at that moment she opened her mouth, for the first time in 2 years, and she said one word, his name. Eli, quietly, hoarsely, hesitantly, as if she were tasting the sound. Lily heard it. She turned her head. Her gray eyes grew huge. Finn heard it. Tom, Emma, Pim, all the children of Martha's house. They all heard it. Miho said his name. For the first time in 2 years, she spoke, and her first word was his name. Eli stood in the center of the square. 20,000 people stood around him, silent, unarmed. Everyone was looking at Hortense. Each one was saying the same thing without words. Through me. Hortense stood and watched. His face didn't change, but the hand on his staff trembled. He'd seen this before, in books, in the Chronicles. 300 years ago, when the last guardians stood against the first inquisitors, the people stood behind them. Back then, the people lost, because there weren't enough of them. Now there were 20,000 of them, and behind each one stood a spark. Not stolen, not bought. Given as a gift, freely, with gratitude. Eli felt warmth rising inside him, not from a single spark, from all of them. 1,000 lights flared up at once, not like weapons, not like a flame, like light. Golden, soft, warm.
It flowed from his chest and spread across the square, and the people in the crowd felt it. Every single one of them. They felt something inside them, something that had been locked away for 300 years, begin to stir, to awaken, to glow. Their own sparks, the ones sealed by the law of the seal, the ones they had carried within themselves their whole lives without knowing they existed. An old dock worker looked at his hands and saw a faint golden light beneath his skin. A laundress pressed her palm to her chest and felt warmth.
A mother holding her child saw the infant smile and reach out toward the light. Across the entire square, throughout the city, throughout Aurelian, the seal was fading, slowly, like ice in spring, not with a crash, with a quiet sigh. For 300 years, gold had kept the sparks caged. For 300 years, the church had said that this gift was a privilege, that it had to be earned, paid for, worked for. And now a boy from the slums stood in the square and the sparks flared up on their own, without ritual, without gold, without permission. Simply because people are standing nearby and remember one another. Orphans watched. His soldiers stood behind him, but they didn't move. Some of them felt it too. The light beneath their armor, warmth in their chests, their own sparks, sealed away, forgotten, awakening. Orphans lowered his staff. Slowly, the tip touched the stone. He looked at Eli across the square, and in his eyes was something Eli hadn't expected. Not rage, not fear, sorrow. The deep, quiet sorrow of a man who had spent his whole life building a wall and now sees it crumbling. Orphans spoke softly, so softly that only Eli could hear him. He said that the boy didn't understand what he had unleashed, that when the sparks were set free, it wouldn't be paradise that began. A struggle for them would begin. Blackmail, trafficking, wars. He said he prayed he was wrong. Eli looked at him, not as an enemy, but as a human being. He saw the shape of Ortans's pain, heavy, stone-hard, the pain of a boy from the slums who had risen through the church and come to believe that order was more important than freedom. That control was more important than trust. That safety was more important than love. Ortans was not a villain. He was a man who was afraid. Eli turned to the people, to the 20,000 faces, familiar and unfamiliar, to those he had fed and healed and built homes for, to those he had never seen, but who had come because they had heard, because they had believed, because they wanted to believe that kindness exists without a price. He bowed, at the waist, just as he used to bow to the elderly, just as his grandmother had taught him in that life that ended with a fire and a beam. A low, long bow, and he said one word, "Thank you." The square was silent. A second, two. Then someone in the crowd began to cry. Then someone else. Then a child laughed. Then everyone began to make a noise. Not a scream, not a roar, a murmur. A lively, warm murmur of 20,000 people standing side by side and feeling their sparks for the first time in their lives. Ortans turned and walked away. The soldiers parted before him, closed ranks behind him, and followed. The square was left to the people. Lily walked over to Eli. She looked up at him. "So what now?" she asked. He said, "Now we go home. We have to bake bread. There'll be lots of guests tomorrow." She snorted. Hannah grabbed him and hoisted him onto her shoulder like a sack of flour. He said he wasn't a sack. She said he was as light as a sack. He didn't argue. Soyeon stood off to the side and watched him. He saw her through the crowd, through 20,000 heads. She wasn't smiling, but in her eyes was something he hadn't seen before. Light. Not golden, not magical. Human. The warm light of a living person who, for the first time in a very long time, was allowing herself to be happy. Celeste stood next to Soyeon and pretended she didn't care, that she was used to it, that it was just another day. But her hands were clutching the scroll of documents so tightly that the paper was crumpling, and her eyes were shining. Isla smoked a cigarette and looked up at the sky. She was smiling, for the first time in all the time Eli had known her. A small, dry smile, like Martha's. Mia stood in the crowd, holding Finn's hand and repeating his name. Eli, 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 as if checking to make sure the voice wouldn't disappear, that the word would remain, that it was real. He stood in the square in front of the cathedral in the capital of the day that had just changed forever. The law of the seal was fading. Sparks were flying, the world was cracking at the seams and coming back together, and Eli North, 15 years old, a former volunteer at a children's hospice in Portland, Oregon, could think of only one thing: that he needed to go home and knead some dough because the children would be hungry in the morning, and that Martha would be pleased, and that Theo, somewhere in another world, or in this one, or in the future, would finish reading his chapter about the dragon, and that it all began with a rock thrown at the back of a drunk sailor's head for the sake of a stranger, an old woman, in a dark alley, and that kindness is not weakness, kindness is infrastructure. He went home to bake bread.